In the huge skyscraper of a large company, the day was just beginning, but it was as gray and dreary as the sky with clouds. Despite the dullness in the company, there were employees who were even in the mood for work, and one of these girls, having come to the office, greeted the director as she passed by his office, noting that he had arrived quite early today. Director Song Jin-hyuk sat at his desk deep in thought as he looked at the information on his computer screen. Instead of working, Jin calculated that if he sold his apartments and added shares and deposits to them, it would be about 6 billion won, and considering that he was soon going to live on his own land, he left the plan in his thoughts for now. Gene was distracted from his dreams by an employee who came up to him and told him that the executive director had arrived, and he replied that he would go see her now. Before meeting with the executive director, Gene looked at the monitor again and thought that he would definitely need to buy a car soon, because if he lived outside the city, it would be difficult without one. The dream presented for a moment that house that he would never see again, no matter how much he didn't want it. But at the same time, the young man resigned himself to the fact that life in the village would be enough for him, because it would at least remind him a little of his family, which he missed very much. The strict and reserved director's face spread into a gentle smile as he remembered his family. The assistant announced director's son's arrival to Ms. Hong, and she asked him to come into the office. The girl felt awkward and, clearing her throat, tried to explain about yesterday's incident, but Jean, as if nothing had happened, interrupted her, saying that the business report that manager Min Young-rak had compiled was supposed to come to her by email. Hong was initially taken aback by such a reaction and tried to shift the focus more to work by explaining that she had a meeting with senior management today. The feeling of guilt washed over the girl again, and she tried to apologize, justifying that it was all because of her father, but Jean interrupted her again, saying that she didn't have to worry. Hong realized that it was really better to stop now so as not to say even more unnecessary things. The director was glad that she could change the topic, remembering that Sun was visiting his parents today, and asked him to take care of himself on the way, to which he bowed, thanked her, and said that in that case he would go. Hong wanted to say something else to Jean and jumped up from the table, reaching her hand forward, but he had already left. The senior employees were standing at the entrance to the company building waiting for the chairman to arrive, and one of the junior employees decided to ask Jean, as if he were a friend, how things were going with Ms. Hong and how far they had gone. The guy couldn't even understand the question, it was so outrageous, but the employee jokingly nudged him with his elbow, saying that there was nothing to be embarrassed about because he heard how the executive director got drunk again yesterday. The young man's chatter was interrupted by the appearance of the chairman, who immediately addressed Director Sun. The chairman got out of the car with a wide smile, happy to see the guy and loudly calling him their hidden trump card. Putting his hand on Jin's back, the chairman asked him to go inside, and behind him the employees had already begun to whisper about the man recognizing Sun as his son-in-law, which meant that the company might be passed on to him. The chairman, walking next to Jean, quietly asked if he was busy today after the meeting, to which he replied that he was not particularly busy, so the man asked to give him some time. Sun understood that there was nowhere to go and without showing it agreed to what the top leader asked. After the meeting, the men were riding in a car, and it was pouring heavily outside, so the chairman asked manager Kim to take the long way. Mr. Hong himself spoke to Jean, asking him that he was Soo-young's mentor when he worked at the local branch of Seek Heavy Industries. The monologue continued with Mr. Hong remembering how the young man left with Soo-young to another company, to which Jean said that it was because the director took him with her. The head noted that Soo-young seemed to rely heavily on Mr. Sun, but he did not react to this in any way. The chairman's next question did not surprise the guy at all, but it made him think, because Mr. Hong asked what he dreamed about. Yesterday, Soo-young asked the guy the same thing, even though she was terribly drunk, but even then he didn't pay any attention to it and simply came to pick her up. The answer appeared immediately, but not in words, but in the picture of how the young man was taken by the hand, and again a feeling of ordinary life arose that he so lacked. Along with the vivid picture, a painful memory came flooding back, that my parents had died in childhood and that ordinary life had been buried with them. Jean felt like he was being stabbed with 1,000 needles when he returned to the moment of his uncle's cruelty, which gave him the impetus to study for days on end. Back then, the guy didn't study to dream again, but to keep himself busy with something, which eventually led to a story called The Successful Life of a Contract Worker Who Dropped Out of College. But even after achieving success, Jean always wanted to be the main character in a story about an ordinary life with his loved ones, and now that this dream has not come true, it's as if a hole was gaping inside, leaving no room for other dreams. Song still answered Mr. Hong that he wanted to live an ordinary life, and no matter how it sounded, this was his true dream. The old man first looked at the guy in surprise, but then smiled with understanding towards him because everyone has something that makes them happy. Mr. Hong suddenly moved towards the young man and took his hand, which made Jean shocked but did not take it. The old man told Sun that he had already spoken with Soo-young's mother and wanted to say that and then the guy's thoughts began to flow that now was the time to ask an important question. While Mr. Hong was asking about whether Song and Soo-young would like to be together, the young man was already looking out the rearview window where a truck was driving towards them. The pain, noise, and darkness were replaced by other sensations that the guy could not understand because he felt as if his wounds were being treated with something wet and rough, but the smell was not like medicine. And when he opened his eyes, he saw a dog's face in front of him. The dog sat next to the guy with his head held high because he was able to wake him up and waited for praise from him. The young man sat down looking at the dog, not fully understanding whether it was Zangan in front of him or not. But when Jean called the dog's name, he immediately barked, confirming his owner's guess. It was very difficult for Sun to believe that it was Zangan in front of him because he clearly remembered how the poor guy died protecting him from his uncle who had dragged him out of the house by the scruff of the neck. To dispel all doubts, the guy decided to pet his furry friend and understand whether he was real or not. But instead of being convinced of the dog's existence, the guy was more surprised by how his hand looked, after which he began to touch his entire body in a panic, not understanding what had happened to him. It was as if the answer was in front of Jean on a newspaper, and he realized that this was the moment of truth to understand where he was and what happened to him. The newspaper, which had many columns and the latest news, had the date October 1987 written on it. Sun felt hysteria rolling over him, so he let out a nervous laugh and looked at the dog from his childhood, and then at the old newspaper, understanding one thing for sure, that he had died, and immediately thought of Chairman Hong Ji-jun. The presence of a beloved friend, even in paradise, became more pleasant than thoughts of death. So the guy, without thinking twice, instead of sadness and fear, hugged Zangan, saying that he was very glad to see him. The guy's eyes widened even more than when he first saw the dog, because behind him he heard a painfully familiar voice calling him by name. Jean put the dog down and turned around, unable to believe that he saw in front of him the one for whom he had been sad and crying for so long. The boy's mother was walking towards him, and he held his breath, afraid to frighten away such an exciting moment. Mom, in her usual manner, simply reminded her son that he shouldn't sit in the autumn sun for too long because he could get sunburned. Jean sat like a statue and word by word pulled himself to ask whether it was really his mother in front of him. The woman reached out to the baby, not understanding why he was crying, and the only thing she suggested was that he was having a nightmare. The poor man looked at his mother, feeling the warmth of her hands, and was unable to stop the tears that flowed out of so much pain that he reproached throughout his life, hiding it from others. Mom wiped away her son's tears, saying that everything was fine and she was nearby, and in order to understand for sure that he was home, Jean closed his eyes and smelled that very smell of smoke. The boy grabbed his mother's clothes and wrapped himself in her arms like a blanket, remembering how she cooked rice in a pot, which is why she smelled so bad. Jean was unable to let go of his mother, afraid that all this would disappear, so he continued to hug her and mentally tell her that he was a good person. Sun thought that maybe it was because he lived a good life that he met his mother and Zangan in heaven. Having hugged himself to his heart's content, Jean went to wash himself because there were a lot of tears, and his mother told him to come back into the house when he was done. Looking at his face in the water, Sun wondered where his dad was, if his mom and Zangan were here, and the first thing that came to mind was that his dad was in hell, but the boy knew that his father was a good man. Jean looked at the house he loved so much, on the roof of which the wind played with the autumn leaves and the sun warmed it. In the evening, loud laughter from the father was heard from the house because his son had a nightmare and it amused him. Dad stroked the baby's head while he was eating and was touched by how his son was still growing up. The dream in turn was thinking that the father had not gone to hell, and at that moment the mother asked to eat the beans that the father had picked in the morning. The boy glanced at the plate of rice and beans as his father loudly declared that he had picked them in the blazing morning sun. The woman asked her husband to eat too instead of teasing his son, and he obeyed without question. Jean missed the home-cooked food from his garden, so he devoured it with both cheeks, which his mother couldn't help but notice, so she asked if it was really that delicious. The boy even licked the spoon clean and, smiling broadly, replied that it really was very tasty. When it was time to sleep, the boy was wide awake and kept thinking about how long his family had waited for him while his mom and dad were already asleep. Jean took his mother's hand again, worrying that this could be a dream, and if he fell asleep and woke up, everything would disappear, and it would be painful to go through again. The guy looked around the room and noticed a cobweb in the corner, and the thought flashed through his mind that paradise was probably created from the happiest memories. The eyelids became heavy, and falling asleep, Sun thought that the house could have been made better, and there were cobwebs hanging on the ceiling. Having fallen asleep, the young man plunged into the water, where he heard a strange voice that told him that he had lived a worthy life, so he would be sent back, and if he succeeded he would save 3 people. When the stranger expressed his hopes that the boy would live a happy life, he heard his mother trying to wake him up, because it was time to have breakfast and get ready for school. Mom called her son from the kitchen again, asking him to go wash up and eat because he would be late then, but Gene was still stuck at that moment of information where the word school was, and now he was already doubting that he had ended up in heaven, because how could there be a school here? The boy thought that he was most likely in hell if he had to go to school again, and when he came to his class and looked in, he suddenly felt more cheerful because he remembered that he had not been here for a very long time. Nothing had changed in the class, and he was part of everything that was familiar to Sun's memories of his wonderful childhood. The boy moved deeper into the classroom to find his seat, hoping that everything was still in its place, and how happy he was to see a sticker with his name on his desk. Sitting down at his desk, Gene hissed discontentedly, still not wanting to believe that he would go to school in heaven. Sun stared towards the doors because he first heard footsteps and shouts, and then the doors themselves opened loudly. The boy's classmates were racing to argue about who would be first in the class, and one of them didn't have time to see Gene, so he shouted loudly that he was first. Poor Song froze in horror while the guys shouted that Jin Hyuk came first, which ruined the whole argument and competition. After some time, the class filled up with students, and it became very noisy as everyone was discussing something with each other. For some reason, Hyuk felt sad for his friends, considering the fact that the time spent at school was the happiest for them. And after thinking about his friends, the guy put his hand to his head because it became too heavy due to the realization that he was neither in heaven nor in hell. Writing down questions for himself in a notebook, the boy realized that he had definitely gone back in time. Looking again at his classmate's son, decided that there was an explanation for everything because it would be strange to constantly think about the guys as dead people. The second thing Gene realized while watching his friends was that they couldn't act so stupid if they had the mind of an adult like him. The third realization was that it was clear why Sun's parents didn't ask him how he lived, because even when he himself started talking about whether they wanted to know how he was doing without them, his mother interpreted this as the fact that the baby had not yet woken up. While writing down his thoughts and questions in his notebook, Sun thought that his dream of living with his parents had come true, and he was very happy about it. But with joy came the problem that the guy not only does not remember his childhood, but also many memories in general, such as the date of death of his parents or the cause of their death. The boy was distracted from his whirlwind of thoughts by a classmate who appeared out of nowhere and loudly asked whether he remembered today. Of course, Hyuk didn't remember either today or who was standing in front of him, so his face gave it away in this regard. Still straining his brain, Gene remembered that in front of him was Lee Hae-won, who was now tearfully reminding him that a friend had promised to come visit today. And with this, he also remembered that the girl lived deep in the village and her parents owned the only store. Sun was able to dive even deeper into memory, where he and Lee were collecting stones on the shore and catching crabs near her house. And as luck would have it, the most unpleasant moment flared up when Lee brought the old crab to show to her friend, and he screamed in fear. The guy then lost his balance and fell into the water, causing a stain to appear on his pants. Of course, there was a joke from a friend about the boy peeing his pants from fear. That's why now Gene still has a dissatisfied face, because in front of him stood a little brat about whom he remembers everything and remembers how she loved to joke about him. Sun was glad that his memories were gradually returning to him, but he decided that for now, he would refuse Lee's offer, and smiling began to hesitantly make excuses. He pulled her friend by the hand, persuading him to come visit her anyway, since this was already a tradition for them. While the girl was reminding the guy of his promise that he would play with her on the beach today, it was as if someone had doused Gina with cold water. The boy pulled his hand out of Lee's hands without saying anything to her, which turned out to be a rather abrupt gesture. The girl was upset and said that Gene was mean, but there was no time to figure it out because the teacher came and asked everyone to take their seats. Lee pouted and went to her place, but Sun remained sitting motionless, trying to grab hold of the important memory that had rushed past him like a thread. Hyuk sat behind his notebook but didn't hear what the teacher was saying because the memory was spinning around in his head, and it was very difficult to catch it. In Sun's mind, Lee's words about promising her to go to the beach today were repeated, and this word was the key one. The guy felt that something extremely important had happened on the beach, but he couldn't remember what it was. Eugene felt uneasy because he felt it was important for him to do what he promised, but he needed to remember why it was so important. The bell rang to notify the students that the lesson was over, and while the other students were getting ready and leaving the classroom, Hyuk remained sitting at his desk. The boy was sad because during the entire lesson he couldn't remember what was so important that was supposed to happen today, so he thought he should go home and look for clues. Just when Song was thinking about returning home, someone called him, but it was no longer Lee's voice. The guy looked at those who approached him, and it turned out that he also remembered the guys well. In front of Sun stood Kong Jin-soo and Yuk Sung-chan, who were known as gluttons among their classmates. Soo suggested that his friend go to the mountain behind the school because a lot of acorns were falling from the tree, and Yuk made a remark to him that squirrels and chipmunks also need to eat something because they will die of hunger if they collect all the fruits, and again Eugene felt a hint. The boy clearly felt déjà vu, and the words of an unknown person about returning back and saving 3 lives sounded in his head. The poor guy jumped up because the words about 3 people and death were pulsating in his head along with the blood. Eugene rushed in the opposite direction from the guys and flew up to the board where the calendar was hanging. Friends, the behavior of their friend was of course incomprehensible because they did not know what was happening to him at the moment. But Sun, pointing his finger at today's date, was horrified by what all the signs and clues were pointing to. The guy quietly said only the word today, and a tear ran down his cheek from the mere thought of what could happen. Eugene froze in horror in front of the calendar where there was a fatal number that influenced his entire past life. The boy was shaking all over and his head was spinning because he remembered that his parents would die that very evening. An ordinary windy day did not foretell trouble for any of the villagers except Eugene. The boy's parents were already dressed in special uniforms and were collecting the rest of the necessary things for the trip. In order to go to the beach, the father and mother took with them the necessary tools that they would need to get food. The woman asked her opponent if he found their son's behavior suspicious since yesterday, to which he agreed, perceiving it as the boy growing up even overnight. So the answer calmed the child's mother down, switching her thoughts from anxious ones to the fact that they had once been told that children grow up quickly, and now they were convinced of it themselves. Appa stood up and looking at his beloved, he also mentioned to her that they were living in an era of rapid maturation. The man pointed to a bucket where everything needed for a trip to the beach was collected, and with that the couple decided that they were ready. The woman was worried that this would be their first time collecting seafood and that something might go wrong, but her husband reassured her that they were going with the village elders so they could at least try first. The second alarm bell for the mother was that they did not have lunch with their son before leaving, as if she felt something. Appa agreed with his beloved, explaining that in this case they need to leave and return as soon as possible because even if Eugene behaves like an adult, he is still a child. The husband, observing his woman's distress, took her hand gently and suggested that she finish the work as quickly as possible in order to return in time for dinner. The anxious moment was interrupted by the elders, who told the boys that if they were ready they should leave before it got dark. The confused young couple headed to the car with the elders, who had already discussed how these doves loved to coo. While his parents went to the beach unsuspecting, Hyuk ran home, remembering that in his past life he lost his family on that very day when they went to collect seafood. Eugene ran past the water and anxiety and adrenaline went through the roof in his little body. The boy remembered that during the full moon or new moon the water recedes and it is convenient to walk along the rocky parts of the coast, and at this time the locals collect food, but there have already been many cases of sudden tides and with them the risk of dying. Mixed with the understanding of his parents' inexperience in collecting seafood and therefore the danger to them, a defense mechanism was triggered in Jin's head in the form of self-reassurance that there was still time before night. The guy was ready to throw a tantrum or cry. The main thing was that it would help keep his parents from going to the beach. Hyuk ran home with hope from the doorway, calling his parents, but unfortunately no one was there. The boy walked around the rooms, losing bit by bit his faith that his family might be in at least some part of the house. But there was silence in the house and no one responded to the baby's call, which only frightened him more. Eugene, barely able to move from fatigue and fear, tried to go into the kitchen again, but that didn't help either. The kid ran up to the table with a plate of wrapped food and saw on it a note from his parents about where they were going, with whom and why, as well as a request for their son to eat well, after which they would return with a pile of food and buy him a notebook for school. Gina was gripped by a wild fear that he would lose his family again, and that loneliness would be his daily companion. In addition to the nagging pain in his chest, the guy immediately had before his eyes a terrible picture of how he later lost another friend who bravely defended him. At that moment the boy was pulled out of the quagmire of dark thoughts by that same brave four-legged friend. Hyuk woke up and looked questioningly at the window from where the dog's barking was coming to make sure he wasn't imagining it. Having moved part of the window aside, the kid saw that, as always, his faithful furry friend greeted him briskly. Jin's head was already a complete mess of memories from his past life and what was happening again now, so he was ready to burst into tears from stress again. Zangan continued to bark, which gradually brought his owner to his senses, and Hyuk really understood that now was not the time to fall apart. So he looked around and began to think about what he could do and manage to do before dark. Eugene decided to try to look into one of the rooms in the house where he would definitely find something useful for himself. His attention was drawn to something that could act as a lever to prevent a catastrophe. The kid opened the doors to the room where many different things were stored, both for everyday life and for holidays, so he instantly found a solution. Armed with salvation for his parents, the boy rushed to the exit with a burn and called his faithful friend with him. The boys ran at full speed, and it was already dark and cold, so much so that steam was coming out of their mouths. The anxiety subsided a little but did not go away, so even after running to the beach, the boy turned his head in all directions but did not see his parents. The child and the dog's attention was drawn to loud voices, which became a landmark. The elders couldn't tell in the darkness whether Jin Hyuk had run or not, so they shouted just in case, and the boy also immediately recognized that in front of him was the head of the village, Cho Il Hong, and the president of the youth association, Park Dae Soon. In addition to the fact that the boy remembered who the people in front of him were, he also recognized them as those who were the first to tell him in his past life about the death of his parents. Only now, having become an adult, did Jin realize that men were tormented by guilt over the death of his parents. Now the children's hatred was replaced by an understanding of what the elders were experiencing back then, but so far nothing had happened. The head asked the kid what he was doing here so late, to which the president explained that the boy had clearly come for his parents. Jin remembered how the elders did everything possible to find his mom and dad before the water rose, and now when he asked where his parents were, they answered that they should have returned by now because the tide would soon be in. Hyuk looked at the water that merged with the dark sky into one black canvas, but the elders still said that they saw their parents. The boy held his breath so that if he couldn't see, he could hear the call of his family, but the darkness was louder. As soon as a small light appeared on the horizon, Jin's heart began to flutter, but now not from fear but from joy that he would be able to save the people dear to him. The guy ran forward and didn't pay attention to what the elders called him because there was not a second to lose. Hyuk took a deep breath and shouted as loudly as he could and managed to reach his parents. The mother immediately recognized her son's voice, and the father was surprised that the boy found this place, although he should have been waiting for them at home. The husband admitted that it was already so dark that he didn't even know where they were, and now they would be able to return. But then the woman said that she didn't understand where the sound was coming from. The couple stood up and, looking around, realized that the situation was really difficult because it was dark everywhere. Hyuk also realized that shouting alone wouldn't do the trick, so he cursed but wasn't going to give up. The kid gave a command to Zangan, and he immediately brought the necessary thing in his mouth, which resembled a lantern with holes where coals lay. The head was worried that the boy would cause a stir in the village, and the president of the association even thought that Jin was lighting firecrackers. It became so bright that the men could not even look, but Hyuk did not stop and swung the bucket of coals so that they would burn properly. The wife asked the man to look in the direction she was looking because it was very difficult to believe. Jin thought about not letting the tragedy happen again, so he swung the bucket as fast as he could. Thanks to the fact that the coals were ignited by the wind, the guy created a bright landmark so that his family could return. The parents clearly saw the beacon that their son made for them, but they couldn't believe that their child had thought of this. The kid took it upon himself to change his destiny with his own hands, both literally and figuratively so. In addition to spinning the bucket, he also screamed. Everything went well, and this time the elders said goodbye to the young couple in words, and not with tears, and while the family was leaving for home, Zangan followed them happily with a load in his teeth, and his mother said that now they were indebted to their son for saving them. The father also picked up on the mother's statement, realizing that they really almost got into trouble, and also thanked the baby. Hyuk declared that his parents should no longer go out to collect seafood, and even if they did, they should take him with them. The boy began to toss and turn on his dad's back and say that he could actually go on his own. But the father did not let his son go, reminding him that he still had to go to school tomorrow, and he was already exhausted, so he could take a nap right on his back, but Hyuk still resisted, saying he was not tired. Eugene was thinking about how his parents continued to treat him like a child even though he was in fact the older of the two, and then his father, as if reading his mind, told the boy that he was incredible, and his mother giggled and agreed with this. The guy instantly changed from a grumbler and an adult uncle to that same boy, and smiling happily watched his parents. Hyuk was happy that he was able to save his family, and the feeling of a heavy role fell from his shoulders. Measuring fate with his own hands is very tiring, so Eugene was finally able to relax, causing him to yawn sweetly. The kid leaned on his father's back and, falling asleep, thought about how he no longer had to be strong, but before he could finish telling himself why being a child was so great, he passed out. Dad became curious about how his son came up with the idea of looking for him and his mother on the beach, and was even able to bring a jar of coals, but there was no answer. Just in case, the father turned around and called the baby again to understand why he was not answering. Mom pointed her finger at her lips, indicating that her son had fallen asleep, so he needed to speak more quietly. Hyuk fell into a deep sleep after such a nervous day and snored sweetly, which his parents were ready to watch forever. The spouses also looked at each other and smiled, showing that they were glad to have each other. Mom and Dad wished their little one sweet dreams in the yard and behind the hill, after which Mom stroked his back and Zangan followed the owners home. Eugene was resting in his usual place in the yard under a tree and looked at his hands in the rays of the sun, still not believing that he had saved his parents with them. While the boy was dreaming, his faithful four-legged friend expressed his dissatisfaction that his bowl was empty. Hyuk felt so good that he even closed his eyes, thinking only about how his future would turn out now. The guy's flight of fancy was interrupted by Zangan, who loudly declared that he was unhappy with the empty bowl. Instead of pouring water for the fluffy one, Eugene simply grabbed him by the muzzle and started squeezing him, saying that his friend would also like a normal life. The kid sincerely thanked Zangan for saving him, saying that if it weren't for him, his life would have gone down the drain. Zangan barely escaped from his master's grip and went for his bowl, while the boy froze with his hands, but without the dog's muzzle, because he remembered that the strange voice spoke about saving 3 lives. The dog placed the bowl right at Hyuk's feet so that he would finally notice him, and the guy really did notice, but only that the 3rd life was Zangan. The thoughts continued, and finally the little boy noticed out of the corner of his eye that his friend was asking him for something. Hyuk said so loudly that he had something for the dog that he jumped up in surprise, and from the fact that he would finally be fed. The boy had 2 acorns in his hand, and he brought them from a food festival at school where his friends had given them to him. Eugene threw acorns into the dog's bowl with an invitation to Zangan to be a family, but he no longer listened and was anticipating how he would eat something tasty. Literally in a moment, the dog's mood changed like the weather at sea, and he became very angry with his owner because he probably didn't know that dogs can't eat such things. With a sense of accomplishment, the boy sat and continued to think about how CX World would only appear in 10 years, when the efficiency of services in the public and private sectors would increase through discussions of ways to improve the customer experience. This time the guy jumped from the unexpected turn of events when the disgruntled and indignant Zangan barked at him. But Hyuk's breakfast with his family was far from acorn-based, which was good news. As always, Mom called her son so that he could eat and asked at the same time if he had been able to change his clothes while he stood shyly at the threshold. The parents heard their little boy enter the kitchen, so they both turned around wishing him good morning, and were instantly touched by his clothes. While Mom and Dad were melting from how cute their son was, Eugene felt uneasy because the feeling that he was still a grown man had not gone away, but now they dressed him in what they dressed him in. Dad immediately noticed that his son was in the blue room for competitions and remembered how he was always in the white one. Mom noted that dolphins suit the boy very well. The mother noticed that something was wrong with the baby and immediately asked if he was feeling unwell, or if something was hurting, but the boy replied that he looked very childish in this uniform, which made him very embarrassed. The parents could barely restrain themselves from squealing at how big their little son was already. The father tried to support his son by saying that Jin Hyuk as a real man should not be constrained by his outfit, and the guy at that moment was thinking that any 40-year-old man like him would be embarrassed. The elementary school where Hyuk studied was holding an autumn sports competition. While the parents were laying out the blanket, Eugene was already looking closely at what kind of competitions awaited them. In addition to assessing the situation, the boy remembered how in the past he sat far away from everyone and hated such events. At those moments, Hyuk was always lonely, which is why he didn't want to go to school at all, nor did he want to live either. Now something was happening that sometimes still seems like a dream to the boy, because he heard his mother calling him again, and his father asking him to try his mother's homemade kimbap, which made his face dirty, it was so delicious. The mother was happy that the baby would now try her signature dish, and the son was happy that he was no longer alone. Hyuk's eyes lit up when he tasted his mother's deliciousness and his cheeks turned red. The boy, impressed by the incredibly delicious food, asked his mother if she had thought about opening her own restaurant and selling kimbap there, which made her laugh because she had heard the best compliment. The host announced the next competition in the form of a tug of war and asked the older men, namely fathers, uncles, or brothers, to come to the site. And at that moment some people were discussing the fact that Hyuk's father came from Seoul. When the man rolled up his sleeves and took hold of the rope, some parents wondered how a man who had only just studied in Seoul could be so strong. The women shouted that Jin Hyuk's father was so good, but as soon as the host said get ready, and everyone became quiet so as not to interfere. The team scores sometimes went ahead, sometimes were tied, but despite the victory of the blue or white team, the students and their parents had a good time together. Mama Gina also took part in the last competition in the race among other mothers, and her beloved men cheered for her loudest of all, but unfortunately she tripped halfway. The woman sat upset by her shameful defeat, and besides her forehead, which she had hit, hurt. Appa asked if his beloved was okay, to which she hid even more in her knees, explaining that she was terribly ashamed of her fall, and that she came last and all she wanted was to show her son how fast she was. The host told the second graders to get ready for a long-distance race, and Hyuk asked his mother not to be upset. The boy tied the ribbon tightly on his head and told his mother that he would take first place in the race for her sake. All participants, including Gene, dropped to a low start, and the host asked them to prepare for the signal. The presenter raised his hand up, and when the shot rang out, the students jumped up and Hyuk was in front. The parents supported their son by shouting his name, even though there were plenty of other parents around, and perhaps the boy didn't even hear his mom and dad. The boy ran like never before and felt his body overcome the speed, and the wind whistled in his ears. The announcer announced to everyone that the blue team had pulled ahead, and the crowd began to roar when they saw how fast the boy with the blue ribbon was. The audience no longer even doubted that Gene would win, but the parents fell silent, not believing that their son was really that fast. Hyuk seemed not to feel any obstacles, and the warmth of adrenaline pleasantly spread throughout his body, and his flexible feet touched the ground and made it possible to move faster. Despite the fact that the boy was wet from how hot he was, the wind pleasantly ruffled his hair, cooling his whole body, and the movement of muscles throughout his body was clearly felt. The schoolboy felt heat in his throat, and with another breath, he remembered how he ran in his past life, feeling the contrast of the wind in his nose and mouth. The guy liked to run in the evenings with a view of the city, which was illuminated by many bright lights. Along with his second wind, Gene for the first time had such a vivid feeling that he was truly alive, as if his life had acquired not only colors but also taste. Song Jin Hyuk won first place in the competition and received a reward in the form of a hand seal. The parents were always happy with any achievements of their son, but this time their hearts fluttered in unison. Hyuk responded with the same sincere joy to his parents' smiles when he looked in their direction. The father got down on one knee to hug his son tightly, who was already running towards them as fast as he could. But the father not only hugged his son but also lifted him up in his arms, saying what an incredible boy he and his mother had, and immediately offered anything as a reward for first place. But Hyuk, first of all wriggling like an eel on a frying pan, asked to let him go down. Suddenly Mom felt a sharp and strange feeling on the side of her body and automatically grabbed it with her hand. The son and father did not yet notice how the woman drooped, feeling discomfort in her body. Only when the boys realized that it had become suspiciously quiet on their mother's side, Hyuk immediately asked what hurt his mother and how she felt, but she answered with a smile that there was nothing to worry about. On a fine day, the boy was looking for something in the yard, and his father noticed it and asked what exactly he needed. Armed with a fishing rod and a basket, the boy told his dad that they were going to catch mudskippers together. The father was a little embarrassed that they were going to catch exactly this kind of creature, but he could not refuse his son the opportunity to spend time together. The boys walked around the area to the fishing spot in silence until Gene looked at his hand. The father noticed his son's interest in the watch on his hand and asked if he was happy with the gift for first place. Hyuk said that the watch looked really cool, to which Dad mentioned how he asked the store to bring him the best of the best. The baby was very happy with how his father treated the gift, and that in this way he was showing his love and care. When the family was returning home from the competition and the father was again carrying his son on his back, Gene finally said that he would really like a watch with a stopwatch as a gift. The father asked if the boy meant a digital watch, and he nodded, to which he said that he would buy one when he was in town and would even try to find a glowing one. The boys were again happy with the team they had, but their mother was worried that her son would ruin his eyesight, so the father asked the little one not to make his mother worry. When Hyuk received the watch, he was pleased and immediately told his mother that he remembered her request and promised that he would not ruin his eyesight. Eugene was thinking about how he didn't need to look at his watch for long periods of time, and when he remembered about smartphones, he thought that his parents would faint if they saw them. The boys finally reached the water, and Dad asked his son if he knew how to fish, to which Hyuk said that there was definitely nothing difficult about it. Eugene knew that Dad didn't fish, but he still asked him for the sake of appearances if he had done anything similar, to which he muttered under his breath that Mom was better at it, and then the kid realized that Dad was about to have his first experience. Hyuk didn't cast his line, which surprised his father, and when he asked why they were in a place where there was no water or fish, the boy said that they needed bait first. When his dad asked what other bait was in the ground, Hyuk dug up a worm from the ground, and a rather large one at that. The genie picked up the worm and showed it to his father, asking if it wasn't beautiful, which is why the poor guy instantly found himself 10 steps away from the child, screaming, "What a nightmare." The boy was a little confused by his father's reaction, but he no longer approached him with the insect. The man immediately remembered his wife, who was not embarrassed to take something smelly or dirty in her hands, and could not even imagine that his son would be so similar to his mother. Eugene deftly showed his dad how to put a worm on a hook, and he even decided to risk trying to do it himself. After the bait was ready, Hyuk also explained to his father that the hook is not simply lowered into the water but lightly thrown in. The boys stood with fishing rods on the shore, waiting for a bite and enjoying the beautiful view and fresh air. Eugene periodically glanced at his father, glad that he would never know some things about his past life. Hyuk wouldn't want his dad to know that his son started going fishing just to spend time with him, at least in his mind. But sometimes, no matter how hard the grown-up Uncle Eugene tried, he felt terribly lonely sitting like that on the shore with a fishing rod. The father suddenly felt how heavy his fishing rod had become and began to shout that he had caught a fish, to which Hyuk told him to lift it as quickly as possible so that the fish would not escape. As it turned out, getting the catch was not an easy task, but the man made an effort and a fish flew over them on a fishing line. There were also some reciprocal glances between the predator and his victim, who was flying straight at his face. When the catch landed right on the father's face, both he and the boy froze in place, and only the funny splashing of the fish could be heard. Hyuk didn't know what to do, considering his dad's dislike for such creatures, so he just stood there thinking that maybe his dad would figure it out himself. Dad finally figured it out, screaming in fear and falling to the ground, and his son immediately ran up to him and asked if everything was okay. The man had to take off his glasses to wipe the fish slime from his eyes, and Eugene was barely holding back his laughter at that moment because Dad looked like a bandit in a mask. Having fallen to the ground opposite his father, the son nevertheless gave free rein to laughter, continuing to hold the fishing rod in his hands. The guys ended up catching a whole bowl of fish, which meant at least a tasty dinner. While the mother was dealing with the fish and her son was helping her, everyone behind her heard Zangan growling, to which she asked if the friends had quarreled by chance, but Hyuk himself did not know what had happened, having missed the moment when he put the acorns in the dog's bowl. Eugene tried to take all the work on himself, asking his mother to rest because in his opinion she looked tired, but she said that such a fish could seriously injure. But Hyuk already knew that mudskippers are not difficult to deal with and showed his mother that first you need to scrape off the scales and cut off the fins with scissors. Afterwards, the fish needs to be turned over and the belly cut from the mouth to the stomach in order to remove any excess. The last thing that needed to be done was to remove the gills and entrails, and after these words the mother praised her son, who was doing well. The boy asked his mother to put the entrails aside, and when she asked why, he explained that he would give them to Zangan, but he himself was thinking about how he needed to appease the bastard so that he wouldn't do anything else. The fish, in delicious clean pieces, was dried on a stick in the rays of the evening sun. The boy came to his friend and put the bowl down, carefully moving it away with his foot and saying that it was a bribe. Stepping aside just in case, Eugene wished the dog a pleasant appetite and asked him to behave appropriately after that, and he, wagging his tail, headed towards the bowl. Kvostik accepted the bribe and gobbled up the delicious food, while the owner thought that even after being a special agent and mastering martial arts, the dog's teeth were still scary to him. Mom distracted her son from his terrible thoughts about Zangan's teeth by asking him to help Dad. The furry friend licked his lips, contentedly satisfied with such a hearty bribe from his owner. It seemed like it was evening, but Eugene was walking through the dense garden among the fruit trees in the sunlight. The boy did not understand whether it was a dream or not because everything looked very beautiful and realistic. Even in such a mysterious place, Hyuk recognized the voice calling him as his mother, so he turned around. Mom was even more beautiful than usual and in the same white clothes as her son, which added even more mystery. Eugene approached his mother to find out what she was doing there, and she said that she came to pick some apples. Looking around questioningly, repeating the word apples, Hyuk glanced again at his mother, and she confirmed that she had indeed come for fruit because she was allowed to. Eugene didn't understand what was going on, which is why he scratched the back of his head, and his mother couldn't choose which apple to pick for her and asked if her son could help her choose one. The boy became even more confused after such a request and asked again whether he really should choose an apple. Mom smiled and said that she was confident in her son's choice and thought that it would be wonderful if he did it. The woman waited while Hyuk looked around at all the trees in search of the best apple for his mother. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw exactly what he was looking for, and it was the biggest and brightest apple in the whole garden. Eugene realized that this was the very thing he wanted to choose for his mother since she relied on him. The fruit was huge and juicy and barely fit in the boy's hands, but he still decided to pick it. Hyuk returned to his mother with what she asked him for and what she trusted him with and simply waited for him to give her the apple. The son handed his mother a fruit, touching it with his hands, feeling that there was some mysterious meaning in it. The woman still happily thanked the boy, and at that point her image and the apple orchard began to disappear. Eugene continued to stare at the ceiling for some time, even after he had already opened his eyes, but he was glad that at least this time he didn't jump out of his sleep but woke up calmly. The guy stood up, scratching his head and yawning sweetly, and at some point he thought about the apple again. While eating warm buns, the boy confessed to his mother that he had a very strange but interesting dream that night, and his mother also became curious, so Hyuk told him that they were in an apple orchard and he chose a beautiful green apple for her. Mom suddenly covered her mouth with her hand while Hyuk continued to talk about how he might have had the dream because he wanted apples because they were in season, but there were no green ones left. In addition to covering her mouth with her hand, the mother also looked away without answering her son. Eugene was afraid that he had said something wrong, or that his mother was feeling unwell again. It turned out that my mother was looking at the calendar where it was October, which meant that there were basically no apples left, and even if there were, they were definitely not green. The kid didn't know what was waiting for him, but the saying "what you least think about catches you by surprise" was more relevant than ever, so without suspecting anything he returned home, and when asked why he was late, he said that the boys didn't have enough players for football. The boy was surprised when he saw that in the yard besides his mother, there were also Choi Mi-kyung and her grandmother. The girl also asked like an adult why the boy was late home. Before answering the naughty girl, Hyuk remembered that after the death of his parents, he and Zangan lived with Mi-kyung's family for about a year until his aunt and uncle came. But even when the guys grew up and Eugene moved to Seoul, he and Mi continued to meet periodically and have heart-to-heart talks. Friends might simply meet for dinner, or Hyuk himself would drop by to visit Mi and her parents to say hello. Besides the fact that this pest Mi started coming to visit often, she was also seated next to Eugene at school. The boy came closer to everyone, not understanding why the guests had come, to which the grandmother, anticipating everything, said with a smile that the boy was probably happy. And when Hyuk asked what exactly he should be happy about, his mother told him that he would soon become an older brother for his sister or little brother, and a moment of stupor was inevitable. Eugene screamed so loudly that Dad covered Mom's ears just in case, and Mi even said that she was going to go deaf. Using his adult knowledge, the guy realized that he had a so-called prenatal dream that warns of pregnancy. Eugene lowered his head, and the grandmother took it as the boy being glad that there would soon be one more of them, and Mi also joined in the congratulations. Mom was a little confused by her son's reaction, so just in case, she also asked if he was happy with the news. Hyuk clenched his fists, answering quietly and truthfully that he was happy, but no one knew what he realized at that moment and how much it hurt. The boy understood what 3 lives were spoken of in the dream, and he felt a strong pang inside from the understanding that not only his parents had died then, but also the little life inside his mother. Finally, the guy was able to look at everyone with a sense of relief, realizing that now everything was behind him. The son met the gaze of his father, who knew how to embrace him, even with his eyes, which gave him a feeling of calm and warmth. Grandma asked Mom if Jin Hyuk really had that dream, to which she replied that it was true, because it's not for nothing that they say that children find out about pregnancy before their parents, and after that Mi asked the guy if it was true, to which he nodded. Mi Kyung became curious about what exactly was in her friend's dream, and when he said an apple it sounded strange because the girl thought that Jin's mother would give birth to an apple while in the background her grandmother asked about the timing and her mother said next summer. Granny smiled at this news, saying that in that case the summer would be even hotter, and immediately asked if the girl was going to give birth again at home, to which Jean had already paid attention. The boy immediately asked if his mother had given birth to him at home, to which she replied yes, adding that his grandmother had also helped then. I couldn't mention to my friend that if he didn't know many people are in debt to her granny. Grandma told Hyuk how his father was nervous that something bad might happen during the birth, and it looked like he was giving birth, so she asked him to get out and not interfere. Mom also confirmed that Dad was worried, unlike her, and because she was calm the birth went smoothly. Having been in an adult body and having learned a lot at a conscious age, Hyuk was a little embarrassed by the fact that his mother wanted to give birth at home and not in a hospital where they would react immediately, and he imagined how the hearts of the people of Seoul would stop from this. Jean watched his mother with concern, knowing from hearsay that childbirth is a test of endurance. Suddenly Mom noticed that Hyuk moved closer to her, but she didn't understand what was happening, and the son simply handed his mother a slice of apple, saying that now she needed to eat even better than before. The woman agreed with the baby's opinion and happily accepted his care for herself and the future child. Grandma happily clarified that thanks to Jean Hyuk's care for his parents, they don't even have to worry about their youngest child. Having stroked the boy's head, the grandmother said that he had grown up very handsome and he didn't mind. With the new watch, Jin's runs became much more interesting, and the excitement was added by the fact that he was racing with Zangan. Feeling that he no longer had the strength to run, the guy stopped and breathing heavily called out to his friend, who obediently turned around. When the dog ran up to his owner, he admitted that Zangan was fast, but in his mind he thought that this bastard even liked to overtake him. It wasn't without a morning treat in the form of a goby fish, which the dog gobbled up with gusto. Hyuk suddenly pointed his finger at Zangan and suggested changing his name to Kalyuyasa, although he didn't understand anything. The boy explained to the fluffy one that he would be named after Carl Lewis, the track and field athlete who won first place in the 100-meter dash at the 1988 Paralympic Games, and he would only understand this in about 2 months. The guy didn't forget about himself either, looking at his watch and realizing that the result was worse than before, but this was most likely due to his short legs, although it was not bad for an elementary school student. Hyuk announced to Zangan that he should race to the house, and if he got there first he would get the goby fish again. The guys got into a low start, and Jean, instead of the judge announced attention, got ready and started. The guys took off, and this time Jean really wanted not so much to overtake the dog as to improve his result. Hyuk ran so confidently and purposefully that at first he didn't even notice the catch in his and Zangan's race. The boy didn't even have the words to shout anything at first when he saw what his cunning friend had done. All the boy could shout after the fast dog was that he was not just a bastard but also a crook. Breathing heavily and sweating, Jean appeared on the threshold, unable to even say that he was home. Mom was also busy with her own affairs while rejoicing at the return of her son, and a contented Zangan was already lying next to her. The dog, with just his appearance, showed his owner how insignificant he was with his 2 human legs. The boy asked his mother if she made gochujang and was told that she did because it was needed for meat and it could also be used to make tteokbokki. Hyuk instantly felt awkward because his mother was moving so much while also carrying a child, so he decided to fix the situation. The guy had an idea how to make the process of hard work a little easier for his mother. Even though the jug was the size of Genie himself, he still told his mother that he would help wash it, which made her very happy. Hyuk armed himself with a sponge and began to carefully rub the jug first from the outside, and then left the internal work for later. The boy jumped around the jug as if in a dance, trying to somehow reach the bottom, but no matter how hard he tried he couldn't. The adult's brain fought with the child's body, and Jean tried with all his might to reach the very bottom, but his little hands did not obey. When there was only a little bit left to wipe the bottom, the boy lost his footing and staggered along with the jug. At first Mom didn't understand what happened and where the noise was coming from, but she looked in the right direction. Hyuk's legs were sticking out of the jug, and he was swinging them so vigorously that he was about to fly away. The mother ran up and quickly grabbed the child by the legs to pull him out, although the jug did not pose any threat to him. It's good that Jean hasn't grown much in height yet, because all Mom had to do was raise her hands above her, and he would completely climb out of the jug. With his knowledge, Hyuk looked at his mother upside down and saw in her at that moment the goddess Thetis, who once also pulled her son Achilles out of the water. The poor guy covered his face with his hands out of shame, and although his mother asked if everything was okay with him, He still didn't open his face but quietly replied that everything was fine, thinking that in the future he would eat even better in order to grow, and that this would not happen again. In the middle of the night, some people couldn't sleep, so one of them joined his comrades. The men immediately turned around when they heard footsteps and silently responded to the appearance of the assistant. Jean's dad came to the other fathers with bags, and everything happened as quietly as possible and without unnecessary words. The man was asked if anyone had seen him on the way here, but he made it clear that he was indeed being extremely careful. Hyuk's father was a little nervous, but he didn't say anything unnecessary since he preferred to act. Other fathers said that now you can see what Papa Jean has in his bags and understand whether it suits them or not. Winter has come, but despite the cold, local residents met Hyuk on the road, who always ran with Zangan, and today the headman exchanged a few words with him, asking him to be careful because the road was slippery. Jean combined jogging with waiting for his dad at the bus stop because he was on winter break. The boy never parted with his watch, and now, as always, it came in handy to understand how long he had to wait for his father. The sound of a bus was heard, and the boy immediately looked ahead, realizing that his dad would definitely get out of the vehicle. The father was worried that his son had been waiting for him for a long time, but he assured him that he had gone out for a run again, and since dad was returning from work at about that time, he and Zangan were waiting for him to go home together. Dad decided to immediately show Jean what kind of jacket he bought for him in the city and suggested that he put it on now and return home quickly so that mom wouldn't worry. The father treated the boy to taiyaki, which made poor Zangan drool, and while the boys were walking, the father happily noted how quickly the boy was growing, and now buying him clothes had become even more interesting, so he suggested going to the city with him next time. After Jean happily agreed to his father's proposal, he heard him ask him how he felt knowing that a baby was coming soon. Hyuk didn't quite understand what his dad meant, so he explained that some children think their parents will love them less and feel sad about it. The guy almost finished the cookie, and before eating the tail he broke into a smile. The boy surprised his father by saying that regarding jealousy and other feelings, such things had never bothered him. Jean finished the treat and confidently told his dad that he was only thinking about protecting and caring for the baby, so he asked his father not to worry because he would be a good appa. The word appa completely threw the man off guard because he realized that they were talking about a girl. Jean noticed his dad's reaction and explained that Grandma Mi Kyung told mom that it would be a girl because her back was thin. The next moment, the father put his hand on his son's shoulder and said that he was already a wonderful appa. Leaning towards his son, the father assured him that even after the birth of his sister, he need not worry that his parents would stop loving him. Hyuk's cheeks turned red from such warm words, and from the fact that he remembered a moment from their past life. The guy caught himself thinking that he had already forgotten the last time he was called Appa, because if you think about it, it was back when he was carrying a drunk executive director on his back and she called him that. Hyuk suddenly felt uneasy at the memory, and he scratched the back of his head in embarrassment. To shift the focus of attention, the boy asked his dad when he was walking at night lately, which made the poor guy's hair stand on end, and he began to invent some kind of meetings about preparations for the new year. The father didn't know that in front of him was not just a child but an adult from a past life, who immediately realized that dad was up to something. This time dad decided to shift attention by remembering the tree and offered to go with him to cut it down tomorrow, but Hyuk asked what if he went to Mi Kyung and bought a tree from them that would grow. The next day, as the guys had agreed, they came to visit Mi Kyung's family with a bunch of fish and called Hyun from the doorway. Choi Jang-hwan was just at home, and Mi Kyung was making a snowman and was happy to see her friend. Besides the fact that the people knew each other and said hello, Zangan also had a furry friend of the family, whom he immediately turned to. Hyuk's father asked if they could take the tree, to which Mr. Hyun said with a smile that if Jean Hyuk asked, then of course they could, because how could they refuse him? Jean remembered Mr. Hwang as a kind-hearted person who was ready to help in any trouble, and so 9 years ago, he helped his parents settle in a new place after moving. Jin's father handed Hyun a bundle of fish, explaining that he wasn't going to take the tree for free, so he brought at least this. Hyun laughed, saying that the man was not like a relative, but he said that Hyuk himself wanted them to bring fish, so he couldn't refuse here either, and after ruffling the guy's hair, Hwang assured him that he would choose the best tree for them. While the men were digging, Hwang expressed his joy that the Song family was now living well, because at first he was very worried about the guy who came from Seoul with a pregnant girlfriend without having anything behind him. Hyun gave Jin's dad a friendly pat on the back, mentioning that he was good at farming and got along well with the residents, although you wouldn't say at first that a guy from Seoul would be able to improve his plot so much, for which he thanked Hyun. At some point, the men moved very close to each other and Hyun asked in a whisper how the preparations were going, to which he said that there were some difficulties and there was little time left, but he hoped that everything would be done on time. While the grown-up uncles were whispering among themselves, Eugene turned to his friend, who was making a little snowman. Hyuk asked me if her dad also goes somewhere at night, but the girl said that she doesn't know about that because he goes to bed early, and then Eugene asked if maybe her father asks her about some wishes, but then Mi said that her mother asks such things. Mi Kyung admired her creation while continuing to explain to Eugene that, even though she was given the opportunity to choose something, she didn't know what she wanted. Eugene smiled slyly and looked at the fathers, who were still standing and whispering, understanding what was going on. The men did not yet suspect that their plans had long since been declassified, so they stood by the tree and chatted. Mi told Hyuk that she would soon go to Jeju Island and asked if her friend wanted a souvenir from there, which surprised him greatly. Jin's eyes widened even more when he heard that the price for the souvenir was to do Mi's homework that they were assigned for the holidays. Hyuk was annoyed that the girl didn't stop dumping her homework on him, and even now she masterfully played the unfortunate one because they gave her difficult tasks which made the guy's hand clench into a fist, and he almost gave her a chul su from martial arts. The young man was restrained by the fact that he closed his eyes and imagined how close his and Mi's families had been in the past. Looking at his father's, Hyuk remembered that his parents had been indebted to Mr. Hwang for a long time, and even Zangan was friends with Baekgu, the Mi Kyung family dog, who kindly shared a place in the kennel every time. The storm of emotions subsided in the guy's heart, and he decided that there was nothing difficult in helping his friend, but Eugene changed his mind about his thoughts when he heard from me that she needed help with keeping a diary, which was an individual task. Hyuk seemed to be knocked out because he didn't understand how one could ask someone to do their individual work, but the girl smiled sweetly as if nothing had happened. Mi Kyung asked for a little more help to definitely persuade her friend, and Eugene, through pain and suffering after a heavy sigh, agreed. The boy reassured himself that he was making such an unfair deal only for the sake of his family, and would not cry because real men do not cry, although this indicated that he still did not know much and that men were the ones who could cry. The boys managed to put the Mi Kyung family's Christmas tree in the pot that Eugene had once fallen into before the snow started falling. While the mother was standing next to her son and rejoicing at what a beautiful Christmas tree they now had, the boy himself was still thinking about whether his father hadn't found out what story had happened with that pea. Hyuk was distracted from his shameful thoughts and joined his mother, confirming out loud that the tree was really beautiful and most importantly would live on, and next year they would be looking at the tree together as 5 of them. On Christmas Day, a mother and son watched A Christmas Carol on TV, and unlike his mother, the boy was not scared by the ghosts. Eugene was lying on his mother's legs with a sour expression on his face, perfectly understanding that the film was based on the novel by Charles Dickens. Hyuk remembered how in his past life everyone watched popular films for cozy winter evenings, and he yawned out of boredom, and his mother immediately said that if he wanted he could sleep, but he argued that his dad hadn't come yet and it wasn't even 10 o'clock. The mother realized that she couldn't fool her son and looked at her watch, realizing that the plan had failed a little. Eugene glanced at the window, realizing that his dad was most likely sitting outside and waiting for his son to fall asleep so he could go inside. Father was actually sitting on the threshold in a Santa suit, hugging Zangan to somehow warm up. The boy took on the mission of playing along with his dad so that he wouldn't get sick, so he pretended to be tired and yawned as he went to his room, and when his mother asked him if he was really tired, he said that it really was time to go to bed. Mom breathed a sigh of relief that Appa would now be able to enter the house and not freeze while waiting. Hyuk was wide awake, but he had already heard his dad quietly ask if his son was sleeping, to which his mom said maybe, and asked if her beloved was cold. Mom quietly asked Appa what he decided to give the boy since he had been choosing for so long, to which he replied about a bag since the boy would soon have a new semester, and hoped that Hyuk would like it. Eugene mentally thanked both the heavens and his father for such a gift because he was already ashamed to go to school with his previous bag, and meanwhile his dad told him that children from other families wished for so many things but their son seemed to want nothing. The parents sat down next to the boy and the father agreed that greed was bad, but he was worried that something had happened to their child, to which the mother replied that he was still little. Looking at the baby, the woman affectionately said that when Hyuk grows up his world will become much bigger, and he will see many new things, as if she was predicting the future. Lightly stroking her son's hair, the mother added that when the world becomes bigger for the boy, his desires will also become bigger. The father also looked tenderly and dreamily at the future man, agreeing with the words of his beloved, and thinking about how much Jin's world would expand. The men walked around the houses for some time, happily waving to each other, something they had once agreed upon, secretly meeting in the evening after work and discussing suits and gifts. Mi-kyung also already received her gift in a bag, while she was really fast asleep and taking away her favorite toy. And there were also those guys who had gifts put in a sock that they deliberately hung on the wall. Even Zangan got a juicy bone, and imagine his surprise when he wakes up from the dream where he dreamed about it. Time flew by very quickly and summer came, and at school there was a break during which everyone went to eat. Next, Eugene hung his new briefcase, and Mi-kyung kept sharing that she couldn't believe that it was already June, and the semester seemed to have just started yesterday, and next year they would be high school students. The girl also couldn't calm down about the fact that Jean had become taller than the guys from the 4th grade, and Hyuk's friends also chimed in that the guy had gained weight during the winter holidays and asked him to tell a secret. Hyuk froze with chopsticks in his mouth and did not react to any of his friends, even though they had called him several times already. Only when Mi-kyung loudly called the guy's name and did it almost right into his ear did he unfreeze, but at the same time became scared. Mi angrily asked what was wrong with Jean, as if he was flying somewhere in the clouds all day. The boy didn't lose his head and asked if his friend had really sacrificed her holiday diary in order to learn to read minds, which is why Mi ate a spoon, asking what he was even talking about, hinting that he would get a punch in the forehead if he gave her away. The guys still supported me by asking their friend why he was acting strangely today, and if something had happened, and Hyuk hesitated a little before answering. The boy was worried from the very morning because his mother dropped a saucepan in the kitchen and grabbed her stomach, which made him very scared. Mom assured her son that she was okay, but Jean tried to say that maybe they should go to the hospital after all. After stroking the boy's head, the mother said that there was nothing to worry about, it was just the baby showing that she would soon be born. The guy got up from the table thinking that his mother had answered him very carelessly and had still decided to give birth at home, but it would have been better in the hospital if something suddenly went wrong. While his friends were still going over the options for why Hyuk was growing so quickly, and one of them was that he never left his plate empty, the young man himself was thinking about how life in the village sometimes felt limited. Mi-kyung thought about the option of eating the food to the end, but suggested that it could also be because Jin's mother adds something special to the food. Suddenly, after what Mi said, Hyuk sharply pointed his finger at her, as if confirming the words about special in the food. But the guys froze, not understanding what their friend wanted to show them with this sign. Jean came home and told his mother right from the door that it was terribly hot outside, so it would be nice to cut up a watermelon. Heavy breathing was heard from the room, so the boy immediately realized what was happening and ran towards the sound. When Hyuk ran into the room, he saw his mother sitting on the floor and realized that everything had already begun. Jean bombarded his mother with questions about whether she had started having contractions, whether it was painful, and where her dad was, to which she weakly replied that Mi-kyung had gone to get her grandmother. Hyuk carefully helped his mother lie on her back and asked when exactly Mi left, and his mother said that she literally just now. Jean pulled himself together, forbidding himself to panic now, and put a pillow under his mother's back to make it easier to breathe. The boy noticed his mother's face after he put the pillow under her and realized that she felt better. Hyuk did everything quickly but carefully, and even now he rushed to the exit with a bang but told his mother that he would be right back. Mom was very weak, and it was already getting dark before her eyes, so even though she called her son, and even reached out to him with her hand, he no longer heard. The genie knew that the woman in labor needed to be kept warm, no matter how hot it was outside, so he lit a fire in the stove and heated some water. Mom was breathing heavily and sweating, no longer saying anything or moving but simply lying there. The guy remembered that it was necessary to sterilize the scissors for cutting the umbilical cord, and so he came into the room with a bowl of hot water and a towel, asking if Mom was feeling better. The poor guy froze in fear when he looked at his mother, and his nerves began to give way no matter how hard he tried to control himself. The son turned to his mother again, but it was clear that she was losing consciousness and her body was weakening. Hyuk rushed to his mother and began to shake her, trying to bring her to her senses, and called her, asking her to stay with him and not fall asleep. The word no was beating in the boy's head, pulsating louder and louder, and the fear of losing two loved ones again was taking over more and more. Mom looked at the bright light of the full moon, which was halfway below the horizon. The woman walked along the beach holding her stomach and was worried that she could not feel the baby, although she had been actively kicking before. Mom didn't understand what she was doing before she got to such a beautiful place, and looking around she tried to remember but thought that it was probably not that important. The woman approached the water and the first wave had already touched her leg, but he continued to enter it. Being knee-deep in water, Mom thought that the water was calming and cool, which beckoned her to go deeper. When the woman walked further, she felt a barely perceptible touch on her hand and the distant voice of her son. Such a familiar feeling was stronger than the beckoning water, and Mom turned around to look at the one who called her. Instead of an empty sandy beach, there was a garden behind, and it was much more beautiful than the moon and water. The woman changed her mind about going into the water, just as it was reaching out to her, and didn't want to let go. Walking among the trees, the woman did not know where she was going but intuitively continued to move. In the distance, the mother saw her son calling her and waving his hand at her, inviting her to join him. The woman in labor looked at the light ahead, and the darkness gradually faded behind her. A larger figure appeared next to the son's silhouette and spoke in the voice of his opponent, who was also calling his beloved. The closer the woman got to the silhouettes, the heavier it became for her, but she was drawn to them more than to the water. Mom reached out with her hands to the hands that were reaching out to meet her and recognized her family in them and in their voices. After touching the hands, the woman opened her eyes and heard cries that she had finally woken up. Mom looked at her beloved men who were washing their faces with tears, so scared for her, and Grandma also immediately asked if everything was okay with her. The woman realized what had happened to her and how far she had almost gone, causing her eyes to widen. Mom started breathing heavily again and sat down because the labor was still going on, and Grandma yelled at the guys to get away because they were just making her head spin. The woman screamed loudly that it hurt, and the granny asked her to push and strain a little, but the guys stood and could only wait. Hyuk clenched his fists to hold on, but at the same time he anxiously asked his father if everything would be okay with his mother. Dad put his hand on his son's shoulder and said that his mother was a very strong woman and could handle it. All that the father asked was to simply continue to believe in her and wait, to which Jean courageously agreed. Hyuk began to repeat the word of prayer over and over again, a request to heaven and to any gods for his mother so that everything would be okay with her. Meanwhile, the mother, armed with a rag, clenched her teeth and did everything possible to ensure that neither she nor the baby would be sucked into any more water. Zangan's tail became a pistol when he heard a completely new cry in the evening from the owner's house. The dog immediately wagged his tail, realizing that he would now have to lick one more person. When the boys were able to go inside, the mother asked them to meet the baby and greet her. The girl didn't like something anymore, and she started to spin around, but Hyuk wasn't embarrassed at all, and he barely restrained himself from bursting into tears again. The father, seeing his granny off, bowed low to her and thanked her, saying that they were in her debt again, to which she laughed, not understanding what he was talking about. Granny told Dad that Hyuk himself had prepared everything as she had taught him, so all that was left was a small matter, but Dad didn't quite understand what the midwife had just told him. Granny explained that one day Hyuk ran up to her with me after school, which was very unexpected. The boy asked to teach him what the most important thing is to do when his mother starts giving birth. And now, entering the room of the woman in labor, the grandmother continued to tell how she showed the boy step by step what to do, and when she arrived, everything was ready. The grandmother entered the room saying that she always knew how smart the boy was, but she didn't think he was that smart. Not only was the father shocked by what the grandmother said, and he was filled with pride for the kind of person he and his mother had raised, but he was also looking at his newborn daughter. Mom was resting, and next to her lay a wrapped-up baby next to whom sat Hyuk, and he turned around when he heard that someone entered the room and was glad to see Dad. Appa was also ready to cry from all those warm feelings that filled him while he was watching the people. Dad leaned over to his son and praised him for how well he had done adding to this basement from Grandma, to which Hyuk said that he had done nothing wrong and immediately asked if he and his mother had chosen a name for the baby. The father said that the girl will be called Eugene because they took one syllable from both the mother's name and Jin's name, so now the baby is Song Eugene. Hyuk softly repeated his little sister's name and raised his hand over her. The brother blocked the light that was too bright for his sister, after which she stopped wincing and calmed down, and Jean wished her to grow up strong and healthy. Jean imagined himself walking with the baby, and for now he promised to become a refuge for her, like a calm tree that would protect her from life's hardships, and he hoped that Eugene would stand firmly on the ground, clinging to it with her roots so that no waves could sweep her away. Jin's father stood across from the field and listened to his friend discuss how crops and people have more in common than it seems, since both have an incubation period during an epidemic, so they were thinking about starting disinfection earlier. The man sighed heavily because of the heat and told Hyuk's dad that it wasn't that hot this year, but the water temperature should still be monitored, after which he mentioned an incident about 10 years ago. The cute guy who decided to water the rice with cold water in the heat was referring to Jin's dad, thinking that he was helping the crops because the rainy season was over. As a result, the rice developed blast which infected neighboring fields and almost destroyed the entire crop, which left the head of the company horrified. Hyun added that he still gets goosebumps every time he remembers that horrible story, which is why his friend asked him to stop because he realized his mistake back then. It didn't go without Hyun praising himself, clarifying that one kind person arrived in time and reduced the damage to a minimum, so no one ever found out who was guilty of spoiling the product, and the guy from Seoul was saved. Hyuk's father once again thanked Hyun for saving him, and he laughed, saying that he was joking, and said that it was time for them to go home, and just at that moment Eugene called him. The boy was carrying a basket of berries, which made poor Zangan drool again, and Hyuk asked if the men had been to the rice fields. Dad confirmed his son's guess, and in response also asked how he spent his time on the mountain, to which he said that he and Mi Kyung picked berries, although she ate more than she picked. The father found it funny how cunningly his son's friend acted, and he asked that now they could go home, to which Hyuk happily agreed. The guys smiled at each other. Both of them were planning something, but they didn't reveal their plans. And indeed, the next moment Dad rushed forward like a bullet, and Eugene didn't even have time to understand anything, so he froze in place. Eugene shouted at his father that it was unfair, while he shouted back that he had summer vacation and could spend a lot of time with Eugene, and his dad was working, but the boy shouted again that he hadn't seen her today either since he was on the mountain. Hyun was left behind frozen with his index finger pointed towards the guys, trying to say goodbye, but they ran away so that their heels sparkled, and only Zangan remained next to him. Little Eugene grew up very quickly, and she was already interested in everything, and she was especially amused by the way her brother communicated with her. Hyuk was fascinated by the little one and spent time with her at every opportunity. Eugene was upset that he lost to his father because he was taller and ran faster, but at the same time he understood that Eugene would not become less cute from this, and his mother persuaded her son that now he would be able to be with her. The young man took his sister's little foot in his hand, surprised at how tiny she was, comparing her to a little fairy. Eugene suddenly got the idea to ask his mom and dad if they had any ink to smear on his sister's feet and make prints. The brother and sister could not yet communicate, but their looks spoke of their great love for each other. Hyuk asked the little girl to grow up healthy, and he, as an older brother, would earn money for everything she wanted. The boy had a more cunning plan, where he jokingly thought that if he didn't earn money, he would quietly sell a piece of his father's land, and then he was overcome by the memory of that monster. The guy saw with horror before his eyes a picture of how that freak sold everything that his father could buy at a negligible price and spent the money on drinking and gambling. The scary thing was that during the explosion of development on the West Coast, land prices also skyrocketed, causing the bastard to take his anger out on the boy. The bastard, being out of his mind, even managed to accuse Hyuk of deliberately remaining silent and not talking about the rise in prices. Eugene automatically tensed up like a taut string from the mere thought that he wouldn't just let go of the way his uncle was behaving. Even though Eugene was very little, she noticed that something was wrong with her brother and even stopped smiling. Hyuk immediately apologized to the little girl for letting her see his pathetic side that gives in to emotions. The boy heard the distant voices of his mom and dad, and immediately switched to the fact that now he didn't need to rely on his uncle and aunt. Eugene took her brother's finger, which gave him a new feeling that besides his parents he now had another most important person in his life for whom he was ready to do anything. Eugene was a little caught up with the fact that not all of his connections from his past life had carried over into this one, especially with Representative Hong and his daughter Hong Soo-young. Curiosity captured the guy's attention, and he began to calculate that Soo-young was 5 years younger than him, which meant that she was now 5 and lived in Seoul. Hyuk convinced himself that it wasn't so important whether he would find a girl this time, although he himself became sad because it was impossible to meet someone like the future executive director. The boy had a picture in his head of the statue in front of the Jaguar Sikh group where he worked, and he remembered the title that Hong Soo-young was given when she came to train to be the successor to the chairman. Eugene also remembers how Sue conquered the business world with her ruthless efficiency, sharp mind, and relentless drive. Hyuk saw not just a woman but a person with a cold and calculating look who was rushing towards the finish line. The most interesting thing was that Eugene knew Sue from another side that was known only to people close to her. The guy remembered how the poor thing would sit up late at night over papers, almost exhausted, and by doing so she showed that she was alive. Eugene waited faithfully for his colleague and helped her when necessary, observing the manifestation of her warmth and humanity. For Hyuk, the CEO was a truly outstanding person full of energy. Jean remembered now that he was surprised by how he saw Sue's charming side on that last night when she got drunk and called him Appa. The boy, having captured his last memory in the bar with Sue, realized that now no one would remember how they had once been partners. Just when Hyuk finished digging through his memory, his mother called him into the kitchen to eat some fruit, and he said that he would come right away. The kitchen was filled with fresh aromas that deliciously and sweetly intertwined with each other, because on the table there was a watermelon, peaches, and berries picked by the boy. Jean went into the kitchen with the baby, and Dad was about to take the treasure for himself, but the guy immediately asked if he had washed his hands, and he himself continued to think about whether the price for creating new connections and returning to the past was really giving up the old. The father sat and looked sadly at his hands because he could not touch his daughter, to which his beloved told him to eat and wash his hands and then hold the baby as much as he wanted. Hyuk enjoyed fresh fruits with his family, never regretting that his career and success now meant nothing. And yet the last faces the boy saw before his death haunted him. Jean imagined what would happen if he did meet someone from his past life and how it would be. But the most important thing that interested the boy was whether it was strange to admit that he would still like to see Sue again. Meanwhile, the young couple stopped at the shore to rest from the road, and the wife, returning, asked her husband, with whom he had already managed to talk, to which she heard about the secretary. The woman didn't like that the work conversation took place during her vacation, but the man assured her that he had asked his assistant to look at a plot of land for a corporate event, and that he had already found a couple of good options on the West Coast. Still looking dissatisfied, his wife supported him by saying that a vacation by the sea sounds amazing because such an environment will increase productivity, and the husband was very happy about this because he and his mistress Yusei are on the same wavelength. The woman was surprised when she heard that it was time for them to leave and asked again just in case if it would be now. The husband twirled the car key on his finger, confirming that they were indeed leaving right this minute. Jean filled out his diary and mentally thanked his sister for the fact that at least he had something to write about because last winter was boring. The boy racked his brains over his diary in the winter and even wrote there about the importance of voting rights during the upcoming elections, which was not the best idea for a 10-year-old. Because of his partially adult brain, Hyuk got into trouble with his teacher because he thought his parents were writing instead of him, which is why Mi-kyung also got into trouble. Jean collapsed on a mattress outside, remembering how he filled out his friend's diary with his left hand, so that the teacher wouldn't guess, but it was useless, and then he realized that pretending to be a carefree student was very difficult. The guy suddenly heard that someone drove up to their fence in a car, but no one told him anything about the guests. Hyuk was like someone had dipped him into an ice hole when he realized that at that time his uncle had come for him. Zangan was also not delighted with the sudden guests, so his fur stood on end and he growled. Jean stood next to his friend and had a pencil in his hands, but no one had yet gotten out of the imported car. The boy ran closer to see what kind of car it was, and from the badge he immediately realized that it wasn't his uncle. Meanwhile, the couple who were walking on the beach had already gotten out of the car and urgently went to look at the area. The stranger, without a twinge of conscience, entered the yard, greeting the boy as if they had known each other for ages, and asked if this was his house, to which poor Hyuk could not even really say anything. The man came close to the boy and asked directly if his father was at home, but Jean could not give an answer to this either. Hyuk was stunned by the fact that in front of him stood none other than Chairman Hong Ki-jun, only very young and without a mustache. The boy staggered back from such a meeting, and he finally stuttered and answered that his father was currently in the fields, and Mr. Hong immediately asked when he would return, to which Hyuk explained that such work lasted until sunset. At this point, Chairman Yusei intervened in the conversation, noting how the young man was already fluent in speech and didn't even have a dialect. While the woman was also approaching Jean, he immediately realized that if these two were here, then somewhere there must be the one he had recently been remembering, and the girl immediately appeared on the threshold in search of her mother. Hong Soo-jong had already noticed the dog and ran towards Zangan, screaming, wanting to hug the furry thing to death. Mr. Hong stopped in front of his daughter, asking if she wanted to play with the puppy, and Hyuk was still wondering what kind of wind had brought these people to the village. The guy would have continued to stand there like a statue if he hadn't heard from Mrs. Yu that the child couldn't be alone at home, and that his mother should clearly be there, after which she headed towards the entrance. Jean suddenly appeared in front of the woman like lightning and blocked her way, asking her not to rush in but to wait and listen. The boy explained how it was that entering the house was prohibited because his mother had just recently given birth and was still recovering. Mrs. Yu laughed with emotion at how smart the young man was, but this did not make him calmer. The woman met Hyuk's gaze, clarifying that she was not a bad aunt and just wanted to say hello to his mother, so she asked him to step aside. Ms. Yu and Jean were distracted by the younger one's scream for the dog to let her go, and they both turned to her at the same time. Zangan grabbed the girl's dress, and the mother was already rushing to her child, shouting if everything was okay with her. The furry friend immediately hid behind his owner, and while Soo-young was crying because she was scared, Hyuk understood why everything happened. Jean turned his attention to the plant, and then looked at Zangan, who felt terrible for having offended the child, but hoped for understanding from the owner, and this happened. Hyuk sat down by the grass and pointed his finger there, attracting the attention of both the adults and the girl. The boy even took one stem in his hand and showed the little girl up close what sharp thorns it had, explaining that the dog had pulled her by the dress so that she did not get hurt by the plant. The girl was still crying, but was already listening attentively to the boy, realizing that the dog wanted to protect her. While the parents stood in shock at how such a young guy resolved the situation, Jean tore off one of the little girl's stems, and she even asked if she could touch it, to which he agreed but asked to be careful. Because of the noise that was happening in the yard, the mother looked out herself, asking her son if someone had come to them. The woman saw the answer to her question, and without the help of her son, only now the next one followed. Who are these guests? Jean sat with baby Eugene in his arms, and Soo-jong couldn't stop admiring her and repeated over and over that she was a little child. The children stayed together in the room and even had snacks and drinks made for them, and Hyuk introduced Soo to his sister Song Eugene, and the girl said that she was very cute. Soo, due to her age, tried to draw the little girl into a conversation by repeating her name and the name of her sister Hyuk like a parrot. The next moment, Soo pointed her finger at Jean, indicating that she wanted to know his name as well. But when Hyuk said his name, the girl screamed, "What the hell is this song prison term?" And all because the name Jean Hyuk in Korean sounds similar to the phrase prison term. The guy felt uneasy, and the only thing that worried him now was what the hell was going on here. All that mom said when she brought a table with food and drink was that the adults needed to talk separately and asked them to wait in the room. So finding himself in his room with two little ones, the boy looked at the door and wondered what the guests and their mother would talk about. Judging by the silence, the conversation was going smoothly and calmly, but this did not help the guy calm down and understand why Chairman Hong needed his father. Remembering his past life, Jean never once caught a moment when his father and this man were somehow connected. Suddenly something cool pressed against Hyuk's cheek, and when he turned his attention, he saw that it was Soo poking a treat that his mother had made into his face. The girl called the boy Appa, asking him to look at the rabbit in his hand, and this cherished word made her heart flutter, since it was Soo who last called him that when she was drunk. The poor guy even got nervous and reached out for the treat very hesitantly. Hyuk thought that these rabbits were probably made from the apples that Yusei Ra brought, and he was even more surprised that the heiress of the owner of a large company had such carefree days. And if the guy had ever shown this girl to someone and said that the workers would tremble with fear, then hardly anyone would have believed him. Hyuk looked at the apple slice that Soo-young gave him with some tenderness and joy, and thought that he had just recently said goodbye to the possibility of meeting a familiar face from his past life, and here she was in front of him. Finally, the doors quietly opened, and the mother asked her son if he was bored here, to which the boy immediately made it clear by asking if the adults had finished talking, that he had really been waiting for a long time. Mom said that she and the guests had talked about everything and asked if he wanted to go to see Dad and Mr. Hong. Jean grabbed his sister and asked why him, to which his mother said that she needed to sit with the baby. Now Jean was riding with Soo in the back seat of a premium car, and they apologized to him for the trouble and also asked if they should turn on the air conditioner, to which he timidly agreed and thanked him. Chairman Hong once again asked the boy's full name, and then thanked him for his sensitivity and for sitting with his daughter. Hyuk was more interested in whether the man had come to look at his father's plot, to which he said that this was indeed the case, since they were planning to build a recreation center nearby for their company. What Jean remembered about the resting place and what he was told now no longer matched, so he was alarmed by the situation. The boy remembered that the Sikh Heavy Industries Recreation Center was supposed to be near the beach, but in a different place. Hyuk remembered that the center was originally planned to be built on the west coast, and based on this he asked the chairman if there were any better options. Mr. Hong briefly replied that at the moment the land here is cheap, and Jin's questions disappeared. The next thing that surprised the boy was that the chairman was driving personally, although as far as he remembered the man rode behind and had a personal chauffeur. Hyuk immediately thought about the last incident and came to the conclusion that the accident was most likely serious, but he hoped that the man was not hurt. The guy remembered the moment when Mr. Hong took him by the hand and started saying something about his daughter, but it was impossible to hear what exactly. Jean looked at little Sue, who also couldn't take her eyes off him, and thought that perhaps he had wanted to say something to his father about marriage, and immediately decided that now he would never know, so it didn't matter anymore. Hong had the opportunity to observe the children and noticed how the boy behaved with his daughter, which spoke of the thoughts that were laid down for the future. Jean only just thought that it was no longer important. Jean's dad just straightened up to rest his back a little and wiped the sweat from his face, noticing the car in such a remote place. The chairman, getting out of the car, immediately told Hyuk's father that he thought he had died a long time ago in this village, since they had not seen each other for 100 years. For some reason, Jin's dad wanted to blurt out something like little shit, but Hong cut him off, noting that he wouldn't have thought that the guy would hide in such a place. Hyuk stood like a pillar, not understanding absolutely anything, but he had already put his hand up to protect little Sue, and she herself grabbed the guy's clothes, as if they had known each other for a long time and she trusted him. Jean began to worry that the atmosphere was very tense while remembering that Hong was going to look at the sight. The boy was shocked by how angry his father was because he had never seen him like this before, and because of this he didn't know whether to interfere or not. Hong moved towards Papa Hyuk just as he spoke to him, but it was too late. The chairman quickly made his way through the thick rice that rustled against his feet and grabbed Father Jean by the shoulders. Hugging the man, Hong shouted in a friendly manner that Song Guanyan was an asshole because it was clear that he would not disappear, and he began to shout how the asshole found this place, and the chairman, almost crying with happiness, explained that if a genius is not in the know, then there are many ways to find a person. For the poor guy, the situation was so confusing and he wanted to protect Sue and find out what Dad and Hong had in common, but he couldn't protect the little girl because she had learned a new word for herself. Bastard, and the men weren't going to fight. Already in the evening, two families were sitting in the courtyard in front of the house chatting and eating delicious food, but at the same time Guan admitted that although the place was modest, he would be glad if guests stayed overnight, to which Hong laughingly replied that if necessary he would sleep outside. Guan didn't forget about Say-Ra either, mentioning that they hadn't seen each other for a long time either, and now it turns out that she needs to be called Su Young's mother, to which she didn't get flustered and replied that time had flown by so quickly that the guy already looked like an old man. Yun was shocked that he was called an old man, but Say laughed and explained to Hyuk's mother that he introduced her to Su Young's dad and before that they grew up like brother and sister. The woman confirmed that she had indeed heard about this, and even more she knew from her opponent that he had close people who were more important to him than life. While Mom was saying that she never even thought that she would meet someone so important to Appa, Hyuk was feeding baby Sue. Jean caught on and took note of the fact that his father turned out to be close friends with Chairman Eugene, and Mrs. Say-Ra was like a sister to him. Watching the communication of adults who were happy like children, the boy decided that he was now much more interested in his father's past than in his own time travel. Father laughed like never before, and Jean remembered how no one else came to his funeral except the villagers, and no one came to the holidays either, including any relatives. Sitting in such a cheerful company, Jean rethought the fact that his parents had friends, and now perhaps he would even find out about some relatives, and it turns out that the future was changing before his eyes. Yong poured his friend some soju, asking him again if he understood correctly that he was planning to build a training center. Hong confirmed that everything was as his friend asked and explained that the company had grown and now they had many employees. Jun said that at the moment not many companies invest in improving personnel through training, but they want to start creating a training system now, and Yun praised the one who thought of this. Guang shared his opinion that the future will be shaped by young talents, which is the best way to ensure the company's prosperity, and Hong confirmed that Say-Ra advocated this idea to her father-in-law. The men looked at how the women were also animatedly discussing something, and Hong added on this basis that after Say-Ra studied abroad, her perception of the world had completely changed. Appa admitted that what kind of wife he now has is truly worthy of admiration, but in order not to spread vanilla, he switched to a joke about how funny it is that country bumpkins have such breakthrough thinking, and Yun reminded that he is one of those who gets tired of disputes about inheritance. Hyuk didn't pay attention to how much Sue was violating his personal boundaries because he was engrossed in the adults' conversation, and in addition he was surprised that his dad started talking about inheritance, which was unusual. The guy remembered how he was sorting through documents and found his dad's diploma, and as it turned out they studied for the same specialty at the Faculty of Business Administration, from which he concluded that his dad was probably disappointed in the Korean corporate structure. Su Zhong, without any embarrassment, fell on the boy like on a sofa, breathing heavily, from which he asked her if she was really full, and the girl plaintively said that she was not just full but overeaten. Jean decided to give the baby advice that if she falls asleep right after eating she will become a cow, but Sue was already falling asleep and was not against becoming a cute cow. No matter how serious Hyuk was, he only needed to look at Sue and he would immediately melt, even though he still called her a wretch in his thoughts. The girl was already fast asleep, but Jean still couldn't find any differences between her appearance now and when she was drunk. Young told his friend that he would not sell the plot, and even if he did it would not be now, and this amused Gi-jun, so he immediately said that he remembered very well how stubborn the guy was, so he would not even try to convince him. Hyuk tried again to connect what he remembered with what he was listening to now, and other than the fact that in his past life a talent development center was built near another city by the sea, nothing else came to mind yet. The only assumption the guy made was that if the chairman had come to this house the last time, then at that moment the house had already been abandoned. Jean watched as Hong tried to persuade his father to sell at least a piece of land, but he resisted. The men laughed again like little children, and Hyuk understood from their light conversation that the land was most likely just an excuse and nothing more. Besides, Soo-young the boy was also under pressure from his father not to cave in, so he mentally asked him not to sell the plot for any amount of money because in a couple of years its price would skyrocket to 500,000 won per penny. Gi-jun decided to ask Yun what was so special about the plot considering that you can't really plant anything on it, and he answered as is that it's cheap, and at that moment Hyuk saw the light of how boldly his father answered. Yong explained that people will do anything, even use government subsidies to have expensive farm equipment. And it would seem that people want convenience while working, but in fact greed was behind it. Yong added that it was enough to borrow from someone or share, to which Gi-jun asked. It turns out that his friend spent the money for equipment to buy land. Yong tried to explain it so that it would be understandable and said that if the harvest was collected a day or two later nothing would happen. Appa also added that in farming time is not the most important thing, but the harvest is more valuable, and June chimed in that growing something in short supply is a smart move, and Hyuk watched as the men threw ideas back and forth like they were in a good game of some kind. Yong mentioned that people plant the same thing every year, and as a result the prices for vegetables fall and you can't sell what you put so much work into. June approved of the fact that the ability to predict market trends was more important than producing and selling goods. Hyuk stared at the chairman after his last words because he once said the same thing during a lecture in the marketing strategy department. The boy smiled, thinking that it was not for nothing that there was a saying that people were like birds of a feather, because both his father and Hong thought the same way even when it came to business. June wanted to take the treat again but didn't notice how he ate it all, and Yong said that he would bring more, leaving his friend and son alone. Hyuk again heard the chairman ask him about his name, and now he also asked him about his age, to which he said that he was 10. June laughed that there was a 5-year difference between the guy and his daughter, and then asked if he was tired of competing with the little one all day, but he said that everything was fine. Hong looked at his sleeping daughter and thought out loud that she was usually very capricious, but today she was not herself, leaned against a stranger to her and fell asleep. The chairman was obviously already a little tipsy because he asked the guy if he wanted to take his daughter as his wife, to which Hyuk immediately replied no. Uncle Hong reached out to Jean and ruffled his hair, laughing so much that he didn't even have a second to doubt it. Suddenly June asked that very sharp question that cut the ear before Hyuk's death. Because the boy's gaze changed abruptly, Hong didn't quite understand the reaction to his question, and Jean hesitated to answer. Appa arrived in time, answering instead of his son that he was smart and would succeed in any endeavor, to which drunk Hong could not believe that a genius father thought that his son was also a genius, but Yun said that he was even sure that the boy was smarter than him. Hyuk felt that the chairman had caught him off guard because he had let his guard down when talking about Hong Soo-young. June looked at the plate with the snack and asked with displeasure if there was really no more octopus, to which he heard that the last one had been carried out of the house. Jean again played Hong's question about the dream in his head, and leaning on Sue's head, he began to think about the answer, but sleep turned out to be faster. Mom noticed that it was time for the children to go into the house, especially when she came up and saw that even Hyuk had already fallen asleep, while Sayara was holding the long-sleeping Eugene in her arms. Friends from a past life slept soundly together, and even in a dream Jean fell asleep in such a way as to protect his friend, which only made the adults feel touched. The fathers took the children in their arms and laughed along with the women at how funny they were, especially with Soo-young, who surprisingly quickly fell asleep, and everyone laughed even more when they joked that she had been busy all day running after Hyuk. In the morning, instead of a rooster, the whole village could hear Sue's roar, with 2 huge streams of tears flowing from her eyes. The girl sat down on the ground and cried, demanding that she didn't want to leave but wanted to stay with Jean, Hyuk, Appa. Mom suggested that the girl count to 10 together and leave, but this only made things worse. Hyuk sighed heavily and put his hand to his head, showing with his whole appearance that they couldn't cope without him again. Jean sat down next to the little girl and explained that Appa would still have to go to school every day, so he suggested coming when he had a vacation. The girl looked at the boy with huge tear-stained eyes and still agreed to his proposal. At the end, Sue grabbed Hyuk, trying to hug him, and Hong laughingly said that he would come often, to which she heard from her friend that it was in vain because farmers are busy people, which is why he completely exploded with laughter, calling his friend untouchable. Mom also shed a few tears when she gave Ra's pet Gojujang away with her, to which she asked her not to be upset because they would really be visiting them from time to time. The car drove away from the gate, and a tearful Sue immediately climbed out of the window, waving her hand to Appa Hyuk and shouting that they would see each other soon. The whole family waved back, smiling, either because they finally had a good time for the first time in a long time, or because they had sent the noisy family away. Suddenly the boy heard his dad ask him what he wanted to be when he grew up, which left him stumped. Hyuk didn't understand the question, to which his father mentioned that sharp-tongued uncle had asked him the same thing yesterday, but his father was no less interested than Hong. Jean couldn't even get a couple of words out of himself any longer, but his father explained again that he had enough money, and that no matter what his son wanted to do, he would gladly support him if he just said so. The guy looked at his dad, realizing that he still needed to answer something, but for this he needed literally a little more time. Looking somewhere far ahead of him, Jean stood and waited for the answer to emerge, while various summer smells reached his nose and the wind ruffled his hair. In the end, Jean, without changing himself, gave an honest answer to his father, and at the same time to Hong with his question from yesterday about his dream that he would like to live an ordinary life. The father placed a friendly hand on his son's shoulder, noting that he had chosen the hardest path of all possible, but at the same time did not say anything against it. The parents enjoyed the fruits while Hyuk was getting a personal cheek massage that he didn't even order. The Hong family came to visit again, but this time they were already inside and chatting together, sitting in a circle, where Ra was happy to hold baby Eugene in her arms while her mother shared red chili powder with her. Soo-young couldn't stop playing with Jin's cheeks, no matter how much he begged her not to pinch him, but for the girl, they were two soft toys. Hyuk was finally able to rest a little and thought that he had not expected the Hong family to arrive so soon. As it turned out, the guys were serious when they said that they would come often, so the gates that were previously silent now began to open actively. It was nice that the family came with fruit, but Young was shocked that they agreed to travel so far just to watch TV. Hyuk's mother excitedly asked Razuni if she was in pain, and she replied that her body was simply stiff from the long trip. Mom sympathized with the Hong family, understanding that it was clearly difficult for them to travel from Seoul itself since the roads here are not the best, which Ji-jun agreed with. Suddenly Soo-young shouted for everyone to look forward and pointed her finger where exactly, so everyone immediately turned around. Hyuk remembered that today was the opening of the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul. The host announced the opening of the 24th Games, after which parachutists descended from the plane, creating a sign of the event. Everyone watched the professionals maneuver attentively, and only Hyuk's mother covered her mouth, frightened by such a height and worrying out loud how these people weren't afraid. The father asked his son whether Card Lewis or Ben Johnson would win, and then Jean had to pretend for a bit that he was only guessing that it would be Carl since he had better records. Young thought on the contrary, reflecting on the fact that this time Johnson had a chance and offered his son a bet. The father suggested that he would bet on Johnson and Huck on Carl, and the loser would clean all the pots, which is why the little one turned a little green, remembering the last incident with the pot. The guy faced a difficult choice because on the one hand he was in the past and knew who would win, but on the other hand no one said that everything could change and he didn't want to clean the pots. Jean asked his dad if he would regret his choice later, and he jokingly said that if he asked him to have mercy on the boy, he would not change his mind. Imagine the surprise of all the adults when the boy won simply because the result was the same as in his previous life. And so the son sat next to his father, who was forced to scrub all the pots but did not gloat about it. Hyuk even offered to help his dad, but he refused, saying that he could accept the consequences of his defeat. The son was amused by the fact that it was interesting with his dad, and that he acted like a real man, although it was obvious that it was hard for him. Jean felt more and more that the loneliness and melancholy in his past life was being rewarded in this incarnation with joy and happiness. After another run, Hyuk stood at a huge house, and it seemed that the village had turned into a different place to live. The boy looked at the giant with his brain, understanding that this is what his house now looked like, but he was still surprised every time by how it had changed. Last winter, the Sun family transformed their modest farm into a 3-story giant, all thanks to their father's ability to anticipate demand for crops and sell the harvest door to door at good prices. Zangan collapsed tiredly into his kennel, while his owner climbed the steps to his new home. As always taking off his shoes in the hallway, the boy informed his family that he had returned as he always did. Hyuk clearly heard neither his mother's nor his father's voice, which stated that he thought he was lost because the walls were completely different. Eugene looked at the floor and realized that the Hong family was home again, while his father explained that it was his son who suggested making the walls out of luss because it was healthier. The young man went further into the house, and in order to make sure that there were guests, asked his mother if he was imagining things. But the answer for him was Soo-young, who was literally stunning this time, and the guy couldn't do anything about it. Mom finally came out into the hallway looking at her son on the floor saying that there was Hyuk, and Ra asked if the guy had really run again, but he couldn't speak. Sue covered her nose saying funny that she didn't know about the boys' training, and the mother laughing with both of them realized that her son was probably hungry, so she would make rice cakes and asked the girl if she would have some, to which the little girl agreed, but Ra asked to add thank you. Hyuk barely recovered and stood up quietly telling his mother that he was going to take a shower, and she smiled. This time the rice cakes were eaten by mothers and their children, and it finally went smoothly for Eugene. The children ran out into the street holding hands, and Hyuk said that he was taking Sue for a walk, to which he heard the standard "don't be bored and be careful." Sue happily asked Appa to take her to the beach to talk to the crabs, and Hyuk was hit with a wave of deja vu again. Eugene was surprised when he saw someone else on the beach, but Sue had already run forward, letting go of his hand. It turned out that there were friends of the boy on the beach who armed themselves with overalls and gloves to catch crabs, and one of the guys told everyone that Hyuk had arrived with the baby. Sue proudly put her hands on her hips and declared that she was not a baby, but Hong Soo-young, and the guy immediately asked for forgiveness. The new arrivals were given gloves, and the friends spent their time much more cheerfully because they had a person with them who was even more interested in searching for something than their older friends. Mi-kyung found a crab and showed everyone how it danced on her hand, which amused the guys. Hyuk found a crab for Sue, which she looked at as if there was treasure in front of her, and the guys behind her tried to separate their friend and the crab. The picture from the past life repeated itself exactly at the moment when Hyuk carried Sue on his back, and she incessantly told him how she would go to school next year and how much work there would be to do. The girl did not understand how it would be possible to keep a diary every day because it was boring, and she wanted to know if her opponent could do it, to which he admitted that he could not really because it was really not easy. For some reason, Sue decided to ask his opponent if he was worried about something because he looked exactly like that, but the guy said that he was only worried that he was slow when he accelerated. The next question reminded Hyuk of their last meeting at the bar because the girl had asked exactly the same question. Did he really like running so much? Eugene answered briefly yes, but it sounded like there was something else behind it because he was very thoughtful due to the memories. To finish the guy off completely, the little girl asked if he liked her more than jogging, which made the poor guy even flinch and immediately ask who taught her this, to which his mother responded. Hyuk was tired, and hearing his name in his mother's voice was a salvation for him. The girl started screaming at the top of her lungs that her mother and aunt were standing in front of her, and the women smiled at her in response. Approaching his mother, the guy thought that what was happening to him was one of the joys of ordinary life. But despite all the pleasant moments, the young man did not forget that ordinary life has its disadvantages in addition to its advantages, and this happened after the guys at school talked about the fact that Eugene was already 2 years old and she could talk. Mi-kyung suggested that they gather at Hyuk's to do group homework and asked what Song-chan thought about it, but he was like a lost cause. The guy didn't respond to his friend's requests until the lunchbox with food opened, and then the poor guy jumped up from the table, scaring the guys. Mi-kyung didn't understand what was happening, and Chan, without even explaining anything, simply turned his head showing that nothing was happening, and at the same time asked Hyuk for a few words. The young man began to whisper something in his friend's ear, and this made me very angry because he thought that she was being ignored. The more Chan told Hyuk the situation, the more his eyes widened, revealing obvious fear. Now the two of them looked frightened, and Eugene began to list absolutely all the gods he knew and pray to them that they did not test him so cruelly. The top secret and scary conversation was the scary story about the pork chop that only goes around among boys, so Mi-kyung couldn't listen to it. The gist of the story was that my father casually suggested going out for a pork chop with him, and how could I refuse? But in the end it turns out that you come not to a restaurant but to a hospital where a scary doctor chains you to a couch, and that's it. Hyuk learned that Jin-soo was the first person in his class to undergo circumcision. Because of his experience, the boy received the attention of all his classmates who were curious to know everything about it. After the incident with Jin-soo, rumors spread like wildfire, and now even lunch in the cafeteria couldn't go smoothly, and naturally Hyuk wasn't going to go through such humiliation at his age. Mi-kyung didn't understand what was happening to the boys, so to her they looked like savages, and even Jean, who was now sitting next to her and thinking about how to protect himself, looked strange to her. Trouble came from where it was least expected, and one evening the boy heard his father suggest that he go with him to eat pork chops. Hyuk was playing with his little sister, and at first he didn't even understand whether he had misheard or not that his father had committed such a crime. Dad was telling me that they hadn't gone anywhere together for a long time, so he suggested eating hot chops, and also added that Eugene needed to buy clothes on the way home, but in the guy's head that same terrible combination sounded. The father smiled at the boy, thinking that everything would go smoothly now, but it was not so. Hyuk already saw himself on the couch and shouted that there was no way in hell they would treat him to cutlets. In order not to be too obvious, the boy stood up, although his sister was reaching out to him and calling her Appa, but he no longer responded to either his parents or the little girl, so the self-defense program was turned on. Jean gradually backed away, denying that he really didn't want it, and his father approached asking if he had really stopped liking chops, which looked very creepy knowing what was behind it. Mom kept telling her son to go and spend time with his dad, but as soon as he felt the opportunity to run away, he shouted that he hated chops and ran away at supersonic speed. It was already cold outside, and the guy ran out without a jacket, but as always he was accompanied by his faithful friend. Hyuk heard someone calling him and picked up speed, but he thought the voice wasn't his parents, so he risked turning around as he went. As it turned out, Yuk Sung-chan was running after him, equally horrified by what was happening, and on the way he told him that his father had also suddenly offered him some chops, after which he went on the run. The first thing Hyuk thought was that at this rate he needed to find a new shelter, and Chan suggested hiding at Jinsu's. Hyuk understood why Chan suggested going to Jinsu because he already had this nightmare, and therefore there was a chance that he could hide them. The boys flinched when they heard the loud and angry voice of Chan's father calling the bastard home, and the guy immediately told him to run. Hyuk ran and thought that he could wash himself every day instead of experiencing this horror. The father ran after his son with a rope, frightening not only the boys but also everyone who could see them along the way. So under the evening sun, a line of father and two guys ran who really did not want to be humiliated, especially in winter. Poor Chan couldn't stand running for so long, so he tripped and fell, which allowed his father to catch up with him. Jean looked at this utter horror while Chan, like in the movie, shouted at him to run away from here as far as possible and save him and leave him. Hyuk now remembered his friend's words that a man should cry only 3 times in his entire life when he cuts onions and peels garlic. And the third time the man cried, Hyuk shouted that he wouldn't do it and ran away, although Chan's father told the boy to return home because his dad was looking for him. The man tied his son with a rope while shouting at Jean that he, such a bastard, should quickly go home, to which the boy mentally asked his uncle for forgiveness but did not return. Chan lay on the ground and cried for the third time with a stingy man's tear, as he had bequeathed to his friend, knowing what awaited him tomorrow. The poor thing sat on the stone bank by the water and was shaking like an aspen leaf from the cold, and it was good that Zangan was nearby, although his teeth were chattering, and Hyuk even began to think that maybe it really was worth going home. The tired, frozen, and sleepy guy was already imagining the shame after the operation when the Hong family would arrive. For the young man, the chairman and his wife were not only now close but also management from the past, which was doubly shameful. The boy buried his face in the dog, not knowing what to do, because even if he hid with Jean Su, his parents would call his parents. Jean heard his name being called in the distance, and his stomach suddenly became heavy with fear, because on the one hand it was salvation and on the other hand it was a one-way ticket. The guy turned around at the sound of the voice and saw that his mother was looking for him and looked very bad, and he couldn't stand it anymore because he loved her very much. Mom took her clothes with her and called her son with all her might, and this reminded him of how he came to this same shore to save them. Hyuk stretched to his feet and decided that he would simply close his eyes and return to his family no matter what. The guy woke up and realized that he had done something disgusting by abandoning his family who truly cared about him. The father ran up to his mother and son while she was dressing him and said that he had seriously scared them, and they were very worried, but Jean had already come to terms with the fact that it wasn't so scary to go to the hospital as long as his parents didn't worry about him so much anymore. Dad continued to tell me that the night sea is dangerous, although my son already knew this, but Mom asked Appa to stop. Hyuk wrapped his nose in a scarf, remembering his friend's words about the 3 times a man should cry, and mentally asked Chan for forgiveness, because it turned out that they were crying together for the 3rd time. In the evening, the parents sat at the table with their son and laughed loudly at him while eating pork and saying that they still couldn't believe that he ran away precisely because of the doctor and that terrible story. The father got up and, in response to his son's suspicions about the cutlet, explained that the mother should have stayed home with the baby because it was very cold outside, so they would have gone together. Mom also picked up on it and said that if you take the chops with you they will get cold, so Dad said that you should eat them in a restaurant, and now Hyuk started laughing, realizing that the Hong family would definitely laugh at him. Relaxed, Gene devoured the meat with gusto, and when he saw that his parents had gotten up from the table, he asked if they were already full, to which they replied that they had indeed already stuffed their bellies. The parents told their son that he could finish his portion if he wanted, and there was no need to ask him twice. Hyuk looked at the almost untouched plates of food and couldn't understand why Mom and Dad hadn't eaten. But the desire to eat more chops got the better of him, and even though they were already cold, the guy took both plates for himself. Gene ate without noticing that the room into which the parents entered together was not completely closed by the door. The parents watched their son very quietly, like a wild pig, from that same door that was not completely closed. Mom and Dad were discussing the fact that their son didn't seem to realize it because he was happily eating meat. Mom shared with Appa that usually in such situations Hyuk thinks quickly, and today he managed to get out of it, but how to deceive him next time. The boy licked his lips after emptying all the plates, while his parents secretly came up with a new plan. On New Year's Eve, a neighbor came to the Song family's yard with a rooster and a chicken in his hands. Chan's father gave Yun a gift for the new one, and he embarrassed said that actually he was supposed to give them something. The man explained that the birds still seemed tiny, but if they were properly looked after they would grow to the size of a sea base, and Yong promised that he would take good care of the birds. Suddenly the neighbor leaned over to Yun and asked how things were going with Hyuk, and he said that they were a little worried because the guy was such a neat freak. At that moment Gene was sitting next to the porch but did not tell his father that he heard their entire supposedly quiet conversation. A week ago the boy barely managed to convince his father at the last moment right before the hospital. Armed with his skills from his past life, Hyuk began to explain to his dad using diagrams and charts why he didn't need surgery, and he gave in from the overload of presentations, trainings, and group projects. The man announced the verdict that the boy could indeed do without surgery, and then Jin's skills as a regressor truly shone. Song Chan's father now loudly declared that the boy didn't have surgery only because they couldn't catch him, to which the Appa said that he wasn't that bad. Chairman Hong went outside in his pajamas after a shower, and with wet hair, admitting that it was so quiet in the village, and thinking about maybe moving here, to which Hyuk did not hesitate to ask if it seemed to the mister that they were already living here. Immediately after the guy's courage, he received a slap on the back of the head, and a reminder from Uncle Gi Jun that he was still the eldest here. Gene sat and wondered when Hong could have gotten the chairman's aura if he looked more like a loud guy from the neighborhood. The girls had already gotten so used to each other that they slept together and no one felt cramped or uncomfortable. The men were trying to build some kind of chicken coop and Hyuk was hanging around with them but mostly watching the birds. The rooster seemed to the guy to be larger in size than the others he had seen, and its character was downright menacing. Gene decided to test his theory in the most courageous but stupid way, and taking a stick in his hands reached for the bird with it. The way the feathered one turned around looked more like a ninja, who immediately rushed towards the guy and screamed at the top of his lungs. Hyuk fell to the ground from such an unexpected attack from the bird, but it didn't end there. The guy saw the famous sprinter in the bird and named him Louis the Rooster. Now Gene faced the rather risky task of finding out how fast the rooster was. The boy threw a small stone at the bird, but it quickly dodged, and for him this was a reason to think about the usefulness of the rooster. Hyuk was too early to rejoice that the bird could be quite suitable with its speed for sprint training, because the next moment this murderous machine could no longer be stopped and the training began immediately. The rooster, without thinking twice, began to teach the boy a lesson on how to respect him, and did this by hardening him with pain at the softest point. Hong immediately began to shift so that he could barely stand on his feet, and Yun was still trying to stay on, although it was difficult. A sleepy Soo-young appeared at the door, immediately asking where her beloved Appa had gone, although she hadn't really opened her eyes yet. The girl couldn't understand what was happening because Gene froze in place and next to him was a rooster, and her dad was hitting the ground with his fist and laughing so hard that tears were flowing, while Hyuk's father leaned on a stick and also laughed. But everything faded and faded into the background when Soo-young woke up a little and saw the bird calling it a chicken. Now it was the rooster's turn to run away from the slow but annoying sprinter. Hyuk looked vengefully at the unfortunate bird and asked his father if they could buy more roosters, to which he, no longer able to laugh, caught his breath and agreed with his son. When everyone woke up and ate, they got together and went to the ice, and the mothers immediately asked the men if ice fishing was done in the fall, and they heard about some species of fish that hibernate and can still be caught. Sue happily stepped onto the ice and started jumping, asking Appa to watch her as she tested the hardness of the ice, but Hyuk warned her that she should still be careful because in that case she could fall awkwardly and hurt her tailbone. Say even took a camera to capture their vacation together, and told the men loudly to catch a lot of fish because gobies are good for your health, and Eugene picked up on this by repeating the word a lot. The fathers were grateful to Jin Hyuk for being able to catch so many char, but the boy turned his attention to something else. Hyuk noticed a group of people on the ice in the distance, and they immediately alerted him. The boy began to take a closer look at the strangers, noticing that they did not look like locals, but the most incomprehensible thing was why they attracted his attention. The father noticed the way his son was looking at the men and explained that these people were working near his rice field. Jean still didn't understand why someone showed up uninvited, considering that the farming season was closed, to which Dad also found an answer and said that these people also wanted to have fun. Dad also added that as long as strangers don't harm them, they can share and coexist. The father put his hand on his son's shoulder, stating the most important thing. Even if they call him a wimp, he would like to live happily and not waste time on tactless people. This time it was Yun who got the slap on the back of the head, and at the same time Jun told him to stop acting tough just because his son was nearby. Appa fell on the ice with his whole body and did not react to his son's appeal, while Hong continued to say that his father was right. Jun added that everything in business is arranged the same way, so you need to think ahead. Han clarified that if you chase short-term profits, then the advantages will be the same, and from this it follows that in business, of course, the financial side is important, but you can't get anywhere without connections. When the other guy finally stood up holding his back, which was hurting, the chairman was just finishing up the conversation that without a good reputation it was impossible to get connections. Jean nodded, indicating that he understood what the men wanted to tell him, and indicated that he would keep this information in mind. The fathers stood there pleased with how far and successfully this young man would go. Hyuk was also glad that the idea was the same, but with Hong's input it sounded different, and he even thought about taking back his words about being a guy from the neighborhood. The guys managed to get hold of 3 whole loaches and started calling them funny names, which made them laugh so hard they almost burst their stomachs. Jean realized that Hong was still a fool and that minute-long monologue about business was just an obsession. The father decided to share with his son that he had given names to the fish, which already sounded strange. But the guy still asked what the names of these unfortunate people were, and Dad started to straighten his fingers and name them one by one, and the first was McCanter. Hyuk was out of his mind from the nonsense that his father came up with, forgetting that today he called the rooster the sprinter Lubim, but Suyung was completely disappointed. Han, on the contrary, supported his friend, saying that the name suits fish perfectly, although the boy did not understand in what place. The Appas began to call the fish in turn McCanter, first, second, and youngest, and ended by saying that these warriors should unite, to which Su said that Dad was strange and Hyuk was still interested in strangers. Jun was as happy as a child when he showed his daughter a whole bucket of bullheads that he had personally caught. Just in case, Su first asked Appa if these gobies were tasty at all, and Hyuk confirmed that everything was fine and they really could be eaten. Hong was a little upset that his daughter did not appreciate the amount of fish she caught, but Yun was there to support her. Su asked Appa if they dried fish like pollock, and he said that they simmered it for soup, but the girl didn't know what simmering meant, and Hyuk, while thinking about strangers, explained that simmering meant boiling something for a long time over low heat. The girl would have listened and listened to this mysterious boy, but noticing that he was thinking about something, she fell silent. Suddenly Su noticed that Appa was talking a lot more, although Hyuk didn't notice it in himself. The little girl once again confirmed her words and added that she liked the guy's talkativeness, but now she thought about the fact that someone might be jealous. Su thought about the last conversation between her mom and Dad, how they argued over pizza. The girl suddenly wet her finger on her tongue and wiped Hyoka's cheek, even though there was nothing there. Jean was already in the clouds or in his thoughts about those people on the ice, and then someone ran a wet finger across his cheek. The girl screamed quite loudly pizza and repeated it again, thus making it clear that she was hungry. While Say was holding the camera, she heard Hyuk tell Dad that Soo-young wanted pizza, and he agreed to take her for dinner. Uni was a little stunned by what she heard from her daughter because she also remembers the recent conversation with her appa. In the evening, Yong was lying on the floor and his back was covered with warm compresses, and the sensations he experienced were not the most pleasant. Mom asked if appa was okay because if everything was that bad it would be better to go to the hospital, and Uni had already arrived, claiming that she knew about such consequences as soon as the men started fooling around. It turned out that the guys had climbed their feet into the buckets and decided to walk around on the ice like that, and now Yong said that if the women knew that everything would end so sadly, then why didn't they stop them, to which he heard that no one thought that it would come to this. While Hyuk's mother burst into tears that appa was feeling bad and Say Ra scolded him for bringing his wife to tears, Jean heard a knock on the door, and ran to open it with Sue. When Hyuk opened the door, the first person he saw was Mi-kyung, who in turn did not say hello but noticed the little girl next to the guy. Eugene heard Mi-kyung ask if his dad was home, but he already had another question in his head. Who was that next to his friend? It turned out that Hyuk and the guy next to Mi-kyung stared at each other for a while, thereby prolonging the awkward silence. Song Gwan-young, although he sat hunched over from the pain in his back, happily accepted the guests, noting how Taeyong had grown since their last meeting. Hyuk's father asked if the guy had come for the holidays, and he briefly confirmed, and from Jin's memories emerged who the stranger was, and it turned out that Choi Taeyong was Mi-kyung's older brother, and in addition a member of the wrestling section in high school. Although now Hyuk understood who this guy was, he still remembered well that in his past life they rarely saw each other because of wrestling training, and then Choi asked what happened to Sun's back, which made the man feel awkward. Appa briefly described that he had gotten into trouble with his back because of catching bullheads, and in order not to look awkward he immediately switched over and asked the boys what brought them to them, and where their parents were, to which Choi told them about their departure to the head of the village. The next moment Taeyong tried to explain the reason for their visit, but he could only ask Hyuk's parents for a favor, and when they asked about something the young man hesitated. Choi barely squeezed out that their grandmother went to the hospital today, to which the adults immediately asked if everything was okay with her, and the poor guy mumbled the doctor's verdicts under his breath, and Mi-kyung couldn't stand it and shouted that grandma needed Puraria juice, which was good for her health. The situation was complicated and tense, so Taeyong, after shouting to his sister that he was actually speaking, now sighed heavily and covered his face with his hand, but still confirmed Mi-kyung's words. Choi mentioned that according to rumors there is a lot of Puraria growing on Mount Gubin, but he doesn't know how to look for it. And since his parents won't be home for another day, he and his sister came to Uncle Gwan-yun for help. For a moment the adults had not yet recovered from the sad news, so they did not respond to the brave children's statement. Hyuk's father miscalculated his strength and rushed forward with a shout up the mountain, also shouting loudly from the pain in his back, and at that moment not only his wife but also his son rushed to him. Jin's mom immediately asked if Appa was okay and asked him to sit back down, and Choi, also holding Uncle Gwan, said that it would be better for him to rest and regain his strength, and Hyuk was watching all of this. The guy listened as his father, despite his sore back, argued and was ready to go up the mountain right now, but Choi tried to dissuade him. Eugene didn't keep us waiting long and immediately got involved and volunteered to go up the mountain and get the medicine, which caught the attention of everyone who couldn't keep quiet. The parents didn't understand what they heard from their son the first time, so they asked again, but Mi-kyung immediately agreed that Hyuk really could go because he was good at it. The girl brought up as an argument that Eugene had been to the mountain a lot before, so he knew his way around there very well, but the guy was a little stunned by such information about him, and what can we say about Soo-jong, who clung to him and did not want to let go. Mi-kyung continued to tell her parents that Eugene was the strongest and most resilient in their class and also a good student, which meant he could handle the hike up the mountain, and then Choi intervened asking if the boy knew about the strength of the plant's roots. Taeyong started to tell the boy how hard it would be to dig up the roots, especially for an elementary school student, but then Hyuk grabbed him by the clothes. Eugene at that moment played the role of a child, perfectly twisting his cute face and asking the guy if he could go with Taeyong after all. And when Hyuk addressed Choi as Hyung, the guy's jaw dropped to the floor. While Eugene was explaining to the young man that his grandmother had helped their family a lot more than once, and now he also wanted to help, the parents at that moment also opened their mouths, not believing what kind of son they had. Choi even blushed from the way Hyuk called him and said that since the kid insisted so much he couldn't refuse. A little proud, Taeyong allowed Eugene to go with him but clarified that it was only this time and only because Mi-kyung was trying to persuade him, and the guys were standing there wondering what the hell he was talking about. On the mountain everyone was busy with their own business, namely the guys were digging and Mi-kyung was guarding the guys' jackets, and she and her jackets were guarded by Zangan, and there was talk about what the sister told her brother about her friend quite often. Poor Choi was already exhausted and breathing heavily, confessed to Eugene that when he saw him yesterday, he thought he was a high school student, to which the boy smiled shyly. And right now the middle school student and wrestling club member was barely standing on his feet and looked at Eugene, mentally wondering how a junior high school student could dig so well. Hyuk drew energy from the fact that he needed to help the person thanks to whom he and his sister were born, and in addition to everything he had a source from a past life because his endurance was truly developed beyond his years. Choi jokingly asked the guy if he had undergone military training, to which he received a rather strange reaction, and although Eugene said that nothing like that happened in his past life, he really did serve in the special forces. The shovel hit something that looked like a treasure chest, and after Eugene shouted for everyone to look, the kids came running and looked in shock at what really was a treasure. The root was really very large and strong, so Hyuk immediately assumed that it would most likely be impossible to figure it out without a saw. Taeyong rolled up his sleeves and asked everyone to step aside since he could handle it on his own now, but Eugene tried to warn him that he would hardly be able to do anything with his bare hands because of the weight of the root, and Mi-kyung was already standing there with disappointment in her eyes. Choi told the guys that getting the root was easy and started dragging it with all his might. The young man decided that now was the time to show little Eugene what Hyun was made of. Choi, putting in maximum effort, began to pull the root, and in his head, he frantically screamed that now the strength of a 17-year-old war veteran would manifest itself, and the guys even believed him. But the fighter's entire strength was limited to him grunting and puffing, and although it wasn't a turnip, he still couldn't pull out the root. And so time stood still for the 17-year-old veteran and two sane people much younger in age. Mi-kyung now confirmed her disappointment not only with her eyes, but also with her voice, warning her brother that it was better to give up than to overexert himself, which made Eugene feel awkward, and he reminded her that she had just said that to her own brother. Taeyong fell to the ground drenched in sweat and confirmed that it was indeed impossible to pull out the root because it was too heavy. The brother asked Mi-kyung to go down and bring something that would help them get the root, but Hyuk immediately said that he wanted to try it too. Choi found it difficult to even imagine that this Polish kid from the junior classes could surpass him, so in a panic, he began to tell him that you can dislocate your shoulder if you perform the technique incorrectly, but it was already too late. The little boy calmly and carefully pulled out the root in one jerk, shocking his brother and sister. It's good that Taeyong was already sitting on the ground, because looking at the root in Jin's hands, he would have definitely fallen down. The guys were returning home closer to evening, and Mi-kyung happily reported that it turned out that Eugene could go himself. Of course, both his sister's words and the strength of the little one drove Choi into confusion, which is why he thought about his shame the whole way. Looking at the boy's back, Taeyong analyzed that although he was older and was engaged in wrestling, he turned out to be weaker than his sister's peer. Hyuk was walking next to his friend discussing something, and his head was not filled with thoughts like Choi's. And even though the guy had already lost faith in himself, Eugene still turned to him and, calling him Hyun, thanked him for his efforts, because if it weren't for him, the root would never have been pulled out. Choi was shocked by such a statement from the stronger guy, so he didn't even immediately find what to answer. Eugene smiled, and just in case, he repeated to Hyun once again that he did an excellent job and tried very hard. Turning towards his house, Hyuk noted that Mi-kyung had also tried her best today, and asked him to say hello to his granny, to which she in turn asked him to be careful on the way home. Mi waved after her friend while Taeyong scratched the back of his head, and thought about whether this was really the feeling that his older brother was nearby, because it seemed as if his older brother from the section had praised him. Mentally telling himself that he had finally gotten the root, Choi began to smile embarrassedly, but did not risk asking his sister if he was really that cool, since he already knew her reaction in advance. After some time, Eugene walked quite actively but angrily through the forest area, mentally scolding Zangan. Before going out for a walk, Hyuk went to call the dog, but he refused to come out of the kennel because his owner scolded him. Eugene decided that he would not waste time on begging and turned around and went to the exit, telling Zangan that if he did not want to, then he did not have to go out, and just at that moment he looked out. Not only did Zangan jump out of the booth, he also started barking like never before, but Hyuk didn't understand this. When the owner disappeared behind the gate, Zangan ran his tail and began to whine as if he felt something but could not show it. As a result, when Eugene returned, he had to clean up after the dog that he called for a walk in order to do all his business. So walking further into the forest, Hyuk thought that he had already gotten used to his furry friend, and that it was lonely to walk like this without him. Eugene began to feel guilty that he might have scolded his four-legged friend too much. The fog enveloped the guy faster than his conscience, and it distracted him because such a thick veil could not have appeared so quickly. Looking around, Eugene remembered very well that at such a time it was still too early for fog, but now, considering what had happened, going somewhere without any plan or reference point was a rather dangerous undertaking. Someone's footsteps were heard, which caused the guy to immediately turn in the direction from which they came. Eugene froze in place, not believing his own eyes, and now the fog seemed like a trifle compared to what he saw now. As if from nowhere, a young girl in traditional attire approached the boy, and at the same time she still recognized Hyuk. The poor guy felt like he had even forgotten how to breathe. Fear had paralyzed him so much. The most terrible and incomprehensible moment was when this woman smiled and addressed the guy by name. Still reason prevailed, and despite his fear, Hyuk was able to see in the stranger the grandmother of his friend Mi-kyung. After Eugene realized that it was a granny in front of him, although he couldn't explain it to himself, he started talking to her, as if nothing had happened, asking where she was going, to which she said that she had gone out to pick wormwood. When Hyuk offered to take his granny wherever she went, she turned to the young man and agreed. The only thing that made the guy hesitate for a moment was the old woman's offer to listen to an old story on the way. Granny began her story by mentioning a village near Mount Matbari, where she was from, and Jean clearly imagined mighty cliffs with dense forests. The story did not promise to be either sad or funny, but it just flowed its course from the lips of an old woman who had already told about the period in her life when she moved to her husband at the age of 15. And that was in order to escape from the Japanese. At the crossing, under the pressure of flight, everything did not end, because a couple of years later in the village of Jaedong something like an accident or a riot occurred, and at that moment the protesters broke into the people, luring them to join, and began to take away men. To the great regret of the grandmother, her husband had to hide in order to avoid a terrible fate, and the woman herself had to take on enormous responsibility not only for her own life. The abandoned and defenseless woman was left without a choice of action because there was nothing else to do except survive and feed her children. An important point was that the place where the old woman lived was called Sipon, which meant 10 peaks. But during the war the area was often bombed, which led to the disappearance of one of the peaks, which caused a terrible feeling because the mountain is the strongest thing there is, and they were able to destroy it, let alone people. There were other spouses and mothers standing next to the woman waiting for the main one to do something, but the unfortunate woman watched as people destroyed their own history, and in this case Sipon became Guban. At the same time as one of the 10 peaks was wiped off the face of the earth, Jang Hwan, who was a rock and support for grandma, also died. Here Jean could not stand it, and out of disbelief that the hero had really died, asked again, so much did he not want to accept the fact of the pain and bitterness that this and many other women had experienced. The old woman kindly explained to the boy that Jan joined the army to avenge the death of his friends, but ended up dying himself. The genie walked as if he was in a daze, not understanding where the granny's story was, and where the reality was, and while she was saying that it was lucky that at least the body was found, the young man noticed how the woman's face changed. The old woman stopped for a moment and asked if Hyuk knew the name of that mountain, and since there was no answer, she herself said that it was Mount Buckman. A chill ran down the boy's spine, although there was not even a hint of wind in the dense forest. Jin's heart not only started beating faster but also louder from the mere understanding that they were talking about Mount Buckman Sanchin, which was also called the Heavenly Mount Buckman, where people are buried. And then the granny smiled and asked if he wanted to go with her. Hyuk barely showed it and didn't back away, but the granny had a sense of humor, and to be on the safe side gave an extra creepy smile. The next moment the old woman saw how scared the boy was, but she couldn't do anything and laughed very loudly, mentioning again that Hyuk's face was exactly like his father's when he was afraid. Exhaling, Hyuk continued to follow his granny and asked if she had come to leave a will, to which he heard that she had nothing to leave, but was very glad that she had seen such a nice guy for the last time. Jean had not yet had time to ask anything, so the woman herself continued to talk about her experiences, that Yoon-gu's son had not received the will, and that she had wandered around these mountains. Considering how Hyuk was ready to help everyone, he immediately asked if grandma would like to pass on something to her family, and she thought about it. When the old woman asked the question point-blank whether the guy still wanted to listen to her crazy nonsense, he somehow even changed his mind. Granny again pointed out that she had nothing to convey to her family, even verbally, but she warned that she would come to the boy in a dream today, and asked if he minded, and even though Jean thought that no one would ask him, he still said that he didn't mind, causing the woman to smile. The granny took the young man's hand in hers, and as if blessing him, asked him to live well and happily, because there is nothing fun about growing up quickly. So the old woman and the boy stood there, and she continued to admonish him to take care of his parents and sister. Jean wanted to say something to his granny, but she mentioned something that resonated in his heart, namely that only he could protect his family. The sun's rays broke through the fog, and at that moment the granny seemed to melt, thanking the boy one last time for carrying such a burden. When the image of the old woman completely disappeared, Jean realized that he was standing in the middle of the forest holding his hand on a stone. On the sign next to the boulder there was a sign indicating that the young man was located on Mount Guban near the Sunyo or Fairy Rock. Smiling affectionately, Hyuk thought that he was not the only one who met a fairy in this place. Hyuk held his hand on the stone, feeling the warmth spreading through his body, and he was no longer afraid. The guy suggested that he could well have met the spirit of the tree that once lived in that very village. By the evening there were so many people at Mi Kyung's house it was as if some kind of celebration was taking place. But as it turned out, everyone came to respect the most valuable person they had met on their life's path. Poor Hyuk helped all day, and even in the evening he ran from one part of the house to another at the request of the guests. Before he could even finish his first request, Hyuk heard him being asked to wipe the table after finishing, and all he could do was answer that everything would be done. Eugene brought one of the guests what he was asked for, but the guy's gaze and thoughts were on the one for whom everyone had gathered today. On the table, among the candles and treats, stood a photograph of Grandma smiling as always. In front of Hyuk, Grandma came to life again, and that was the moment when she fried sweet potatoes and called him to try them too. The only thing the guy thought about when he looked at the granny's photo was that he was very lucky. The young man remembered how he felt the touch of his grandmother's hands on his own, and realized that it had cost him a lot to see her off on her final journey. The boy's thoughts were interrupted by Mi Kyung, who told her friend that his mother had asked them to rest and eat. The little girl had a tray of treats for two in her hands, which meant that they definitely wouldn't be sitting in the house. The guys settled behind the side wall of the house away from the guests and noise, and then Mi was finally able to exhale and even complained that she was very tired today because people had been coming since early morning, but even in this Hyuk found a lot of good. The girl looked at the guests and her family and how they were smiling and not crying or just silent, and asked her friend again if he really thought that everything was fine. Eugene confirmed that everyone who came today sincerely wanted to say goodbye to Grandma and thank her even just for being there for them. Mi Kyung smiled while looking somewhere in front of her and said that she really appreciated how everyone loved her grandmother. Hyuk only made an assumption that Grandma probably went to a good place, and to Mi's surprise she confirmed this, and to his silent question the old lady said that she saw her yesterday in a dream. The girl's dream was a little different from what Hyuk had dreamed of, but it was still beautiful. I confidently stated that I immediately realized that it was my grandmother in front of me, even though she looked like her incredibly beautiful sister. Remembering the touch of my granny's hands on my face, I understood even without words that she had come to say goodbye. As it turned out, Grandma came to Mom and Dad in a dream, and Mi found it amazing that the whole family had the same dream. The girl also thought that her grandmother was able to come to them in a dream because she became a fairy, and Hyuk agreed, smiling mysteriously. Mi remembered what Mom said about the ritual on Sunya Rock and asked if Eugene would go with her. Eugene agreed without hesitation, adding that he was more than sure that Grandma would have liked it. Looking somewhere into the distance after the words about the memorial service, Hyuk closed his eyes with the thought that he was ready to do anything for his grandmother. The words of his grandmother softly flew through the boy's head, asking him to live well and take care of his family, and at that moment he was holding his sister in his arms and felt the old woman stroking his head. I looked at the starry sky and took a deep breath, not because it was hard but because I wanted to catch that very moment. The girl managed to catch what her grandmother smelled like, and it was the whole world that now surrounded her. There were some tears on the part of his granddaughter, but Eugene did not go anywhere and stayed to share the bitterness of loss with his friend. Now all that was left was to imagine how Grandma met her love, which she thought she had lost forever. Time flew by very quickly, but it felt completely different for Eugene, and now he's in 6th grade, and in front of him and his classmates stands teacher Choi Young-mook, getting to know everyone. Hyuk joined in the wave of joyful exclamations of his classmates, but unlike them he simply smiled. While the boy was thinking about the fact that the school was not able to have several class teachers, the teacher announced the selection of the class president. Mr. Mook also warned that the class president would also be the student council president, and asked who would like to participate in this, to which the students almost unanimously shouted for Jin Hyuk to become the class president. The young man himself didn't particularly like the idea, although it was obvious that everyone would want to choose him because of his academic performance at school. The teacher agreed with the candidate for headman and immediately announced who would like to become an assistant, and then a forest of hands appeared, among which were Mi Kyung and Sun Chan, which is why poor Jin even got scared. Hyuk's friends looked at each other as if they were ready to even fight for the assistant's position. The class teacher asked again if anyone else besides the boys wanted to be an assistant, but at that moment Mi Kyung made the others afraid of her, so Mr. Mook said that in the first semester Mi's assistant would be, and in the second Sun Chan. In the evening, the mother was a little shocked by such news, even though she already knew about her son's success. While sorting things out, the mother praised her son for being smart just like his father, but Hyuk brushed it off, saying that there was nothing wrong with him being the head boy and president at school. Mom still insisted that this was an incredible success that not everyone can achieve, and my sister picked up on this delight, asking if Appa was cool. Eugene heard that now her appa is the class president, and in that case he should be congratulated, after which the little girl froze a little looking at her brother because she realized that he is cool but did not understand why. While handing the sock to appa, Eugene still congratulated Hyuk, although she didn't understand why, but that was enough to knock her brother out cold. Jean couldn't stand it and pushed his sister to the floor, hugging her and saying how well she already speaks, which made Mom laugh out loud. But Eugene didn't really like this idea and she started calling for help. Hyuk's morning at school began with the fact that at the entrance he saw a poster with his name where he was congratulated on winning a prize in mathematics. The guy didn't go far because he heard someone calling him behind his back, and it sounded like Mi Kyung. The girlfriend was really catching up with her friend, and when she was already closer, Hyuk greeted her in return. Mi asked her friend if he had brought it, and then a bunch of objects appeared in Jin's head, and he tried to figure out if he had forgotten anything. After making sure that he hadn't forgotten anything, the guy said that he had taken everything he needed, but Mi asked again if he had taken what was needed. Jin was starting to dislike this kind of mystery, so he said directly how he could bring something he didn't even know about, after which Mi asked him to lean towards her. When Hyuk was close to Mi, she whispered in his ear whether the guy had brought that medical test. Jin smiled and replied that if we were talking about a bag for collecting biomaterial, then of course he brought everything. But when the young man asked his friend if she had forgotten to bring it, he saw a reaction that only confirmed his fears. Already at that moment, Jin felt something was wrong, looking at how Mi Kyung was embarrassed and clearly wanted to say something else. And when he heard the request, his eyes widened like never before in his life. Poor Mi stood there embarrassed and red as a lobster after asking Hyuk to share his material with her. Considering how impressed the young man was, he burst into a loud voice, and Mi had to hiss and cover his mouth with her finger just so that he would start speaking more quietly. Jin felt even more sick after his friend explained that she couldn't take the material from someone else because she would have to take a parasite test in front of everyone, but Hyuk was clean. Mi had to beg a friend to pull off such an adventure, and it already looked strange to others, but Hyuk himself at that moment thought that she had completely gone crazy. Jin, putting his hand to his face, nevertheless overcame himself, realizing that Mi was at just such an age that she was now clearly terribly ashamed to ask for such a thing. The guy simply extended his hand to Mi, asking her to give him an envelope, and she was happier than ever. Mi handed her friend an envelope, rejoicing like a child while saying that she would definitely repay the debt, but this did not calm Hyuk down, so he simply asked her to go first and he would go to the toilet, and after that he would also go to class. Entering the men's room, Jin prepared himself for the worst, but luckily, he heard that he was not alone. Judging by the sounds in the booth, someone else forgot to bring the material, so Hyuk knocked and asked if anyone was there. It was hard not to respond to the voice of the student council president, but the voice of the one in the booth was also familiar to Jin. The guy was grateful to heaven for his salvation and generally considered such a coincidence to be fate. The teacher collected envelopes in a bag while the children ran from class to class. When Mi Kyung happily entered the classroom, not suspecting anything, Hyuk on the contrary tensed up, and the rest of the guys along with him. Optimism was now Jin's only salvation, so he reassured himself, albeit questioningly, that everything would be fine. And so 2 weeks later, there was the day X when the teacher announced that those whom he would name would come and take the medicine, and one of them was the assistant to the headman and friend of Yuk Sun Chan. Sun Chan went to the table as if to hard labor, and Mi was surprised that Jin Soo was not invited this time, although he was always in the front row, and then Hyuk breathed a sigh of relief. The teacher noticed how the children were whispering and looked carefully at his list. The next ones called to the table were Kang Jin Soo and Mi Kyung, who flinched, turned pale, and were horrified. The boys stood at the table while the teacher gave them medicine, and it was terribly embarrassing. Poor Mi was horrified by the fact that the jar contained a month's dose of the drug, but what was even more terrifying was that rumors immediately began to spread behind her back. The incinerating gaze of the evil Mi Kyung immediately turned to Hyuk, and in front of him, absolutely all the students bent down to their desks with their faces in order not to get caught in the crossfire. Jin started to mumble something under his breath, something like an explanation, but it was too late as Mi was already ready to devour him whole. The next moment, the students were treated to a funny sight of Mi Kyung chasing her friend under the school windows. The girlfriend shouted at Hyuk that he was an idiot and an asshole, but it didn't help because the guy ran on a regular basis and he wasn't afraid. Mi furiously shouted that she asked for Jin's sample and not Jin Soo's, but Hyuk had a mantra in his head that he had already apologized, and besides, if Mi had taken this responsibly from the very beginning, then nothing would have happened. The girl chased after her friend, calling him a bastard and begging him to stop, but at that moment Jin remembered from his past life also an evil but adult Mi, and he was overcome with pleasant nostalgia, and at that moment she was overcome so much that she threw up. Meanwhile, in the office of Myeong Junior High School, a conversation was taking place about where the regional qualifying tournament for the youth sports competitions would be held next year, and for now the choice fell on Taeyong Middle School. The principal asked the teacher if there were people in their school who could be sent to the marathon, and the teacher confirmed this. The headmaster suddenly screamed after looking at the lists, and his reaction was due to the name Song Jin-hyuk. The teacher asked the principal if he knew the student, and he said directly that he was most likely his enemy because their school was not showing particularly good results precisely because of this guy. The teacher turned his attention to Hyuk's profile and heard that they tried to lure the guy away on behalf of the director, but he refused. Being shocked, the teacher asked again whether he had understood correctly that they were trying to lure away an elementary school student, and allegedly heard the argument that a school that shows good results gets more funding. The head of the school was confused and did not know how to tell the higher-ups about everything, to which the teacher calmly replied that Hyuk's mental abilities did not immediately mean that he was a good runner. Mi-kyung finally caught up with the scoundrel and almost shook the life out of him, but she had no intention of stopping. Jean just prayed for it to end quickly, continuing to quietly say that he had already apologized many times. After one good shake-up called Mi-kyung, Jean was stunned by another news that he will be taking part in the youth sports festival. At first, the teacher didn't even know how to find the words to explain, and he was able to tell how every May in Cheongsam-do they hold that very festival to which all schools must send athletes. The teacher felt awkward after the guy asked why he was hearing about his participation for the first time, so the teacher had to justify himself with a compliment that there was no one else to send except Heck. After asking Jean for forgiveness, the teacher again made excuses by saying that the deadline for submitting documents was approaching, so there was no time to ask the guy directly about his wishes. Immediately after being presented with the facts, the student was told that the coach from Taeyong Elementary School was already waiting on the field. The teacher said at the end that Hyuk's class teacher had been warned, so the young man didn't have to worry, but it didn't matter to him anymore. The invited guests looked around the school field and discussed the fact that it turned out to be much larger than they imagined, especially considering that there was only one class for each grade level. One of the teachers made his guess that the number of buses going to the city has increased, and so the school has developed, to which he heard in response another assumption that they want to make this area a center of tourism. Hyuk and the teacher were already heading towards the guests, and along the way they explained to the boy that after raising the flag and firing the shot, he had to immediately run as fast as he could. Before Jean could answer the teacher's question of whether everything was clear, the question of who that teacher was surfaced in his memory, and he still doubted whether it was really Kim Yong-tae. The boy remembered how it was his teacher Kim Yong-tae who played an important role in his life after his parents died. Hyuk remembered very well how after the loss of his loved ones he was forced to transfer to Taeyong Elementary School, where Yun taught physical education, and at that moment the teacher had already introduced the student council president to the guests. While the other teacher praised the student's growth, Mr. Yong couldn't believe that such an unusual child was doing in a village school. Mr. Yun felt a little uneasy because his expectations about the guy did not match reality, because the young man was definitely too good for this school. Teacher Yong got straight to the point and informed both the teacher and the student that the results would only be assessed after completing the 100-meter dash. Hyuk was reassured that other schools also use preliminary competitions, so he had no need to worry, but they didn't know that the guy had already lived his life and he was calmer now than ever. The teacher calmed Jean down with a shaking voice and asked him to breathe deeply, but he was already mentally asking the teacher himself to calm down. Mr. Yong prepared himself and turned his gaze towards the student to assess the overall situation. At the beginning of the line, Jean was adjusting his sneakers and the teacher was shaking like an aspen leaf next to him and not breathing deeply as he advised the guy to do. Hyuk smiled to himself as he repeated his teacher's words about not being nervous and prepared for the run. With thoughts that he had never been nervous, Jean took off at the signal and everything around him seemed to slow down and there was only him and the strip. To say that Teacher Yong was shocked is to say nothing, because at the very least he saw something that he had either never seen before or had seen rarely. At the very least, the teacher was amazed by the guy's ideal knee and elbow height, and the length of his steps and the crossing of his legs made him open his mouth in surprise. The physical education teacher looked at the unsurpassed ideal of someone who could truly boldly take part and not limit himself to just one marathon from the school. The adult man and the teacher could not understand how the young man could achieve such amazing results without being involved in professional sports. The most interesting part was behind him, because Teacher Yong had not yet seen what Hyuk had been working so hard on all this time. Looking at the stopwatch, Yong couldn't even believe his eyes, because it showed a rather dubious result for a real elementary school student. Mr. Kim asked his colleague to help him check the result again, to which he was surprised but agreed. Jin Hyuk was asked to run again, but he was only too happy to try because he loved this business both in his past life and in this one. While the guy was running to the starting line, Yong looked after him and did not understand how what he had just said was even possible. The coach also noted for himself that Jin achieved such a good result despite the fact that he was not in athletic shape. The second time the signal and the second time the race, and Hyuk didn't care about the time. He liked how he felt his body and how the wind whistled in his ears, but the teachers were already both looking at the stopwatch and the jaws of two of them were already dropped. The second time Jin showed an even better result, and this was a completely new experience for the coaches who did not believe in the students' abilities at all at first. Hyuk stood calmly and evened out his breathing, thinking that he could have run like this a few more times, but this was just a warm-up. A week later, the teacher noticed Jin had new sneakers and asked if he had bought them specifically for the tryouts, and he proudly declared that it was all his dad's doing. Hyuk decided to skip the part about how his dad reacted violently to the news about the competition and how he was ready to buy any sneakers for his son because he was bursting with pride. Surprisingly, the guy's thoughts were not currently occupied with the competition, but rather he was thinking about the fact that he had not been to Taeyong High School for a long time, since he usually spent most of his time here. Also, two guys whom Jin met in his past life at Taeyong School have not disappeared from his memory, and if he manages to move forward next year, he will meet them again. The steps of the school were noisy as many teams had gathered, and everyone was discussing the likelihood of winning or losing. Hyuk heard his teacher tell him not to be nervous again, and at the same time he nervously tucked his shirt into his shorts. For obvious reasons, the coach had reminded Jin for the 100th time to run immediately after the shot, but he simply silently took in the information and stood like a statue waiting for his clothes to be tucked in sufficiently. How awkward it was for the boy that the school gave him a pink uniform for the selections, but there was nothing he could do. The embarrassment disappeared as if by magic after the coach sincerely shared with Jin that this would be the first participation in competitions since the founding of their school. The most important revelation was the teacher's admission that he was proud of his student, even though this was only a qualifying competition. The loudspeaker announced group number 4 and that it was time to get ready, and this was about Jin, but the most important thing had already been said. The participants stood at the starting line, and compared to the other guys, Jin really did look much bigger, which is why he saw people looking at him from time to time. There was also some whispering about who this mysterious young man was, and that he couldn't be from the younger classes because he was incredibly tall. The coach announced the start and attention, and Hyuk, as if in excitement, prepared for a fun undertaking without thinking about winning. Closing his eyes, the guy concentrated simultaneously on everything that surrounded him and on nothing, which caused a ticklish feeling inside him, as if something new was about to be discovered. In his thoughts, Jin was already somewhere on the strip, so all that was left was to hear the cherished march, and when this happened his eyes opened and all that was left was to enjoy this run as well as all the others. A shot rang out, and those same high knees rushed ahead of their owner, making it clear that he was fast and strong as always. Jin rushed forward without pride or, on the contrary, playing along with others, but ran simply as he liked and as he felt, and he felt freedom. Judging by the expressions on the faces of the other participants, they were acting out of frustration, unlike Hyuk, who clearly understood what he was doing and why. The teacher was rooting for his Jin with all his might, while others were discussing how the guy didn't look like a junior school student with his abilities. Jin had already run past the coach, and he recorded the time while the other guys were just running up to him. The curator was asked to record the time, but he had already fulfilled the request but stood there like a pillar, as if he could not see anything other than the result on the stopwatch. When the curator's gaze finally tore itself away from the stopwatch, he was asked just in case if everything was okay with him, and he, still in shock, confirmed that everything was fine with him. The coach couldn't keep silent and nevertheless told his colleague that the results were incredible for an ordinary boy. In addition to the usual information about the student, it was also indicated that he had never taken part in a competition before, but he passed it better than the other children who trained hard. Hyuk stood to the side because he didn't know any of the students here, but the guys found him themselves, and the first thing the guy heard was that he was very cool considering his speed. Park Ji-bum from Taeyong High School, with a funny but stylish hairstyle, extended his hand to Jin and introduced the guys, where on the left was Yeom Byung-taek with a rather shy face and a smiling Cho Sol-chan. The young man willingly greeted the guys and introduced himself in response, once again hearing along the way how tall he was. Chan noticed that Hyuk's sneakers, although quite good, clearly lacked spikes for such competitions, since running on a track is a completely different thing. The new friend was amazed that Jean was able to run so fast even in non-studded sneakers, and meanwhile the teacher was already calling the young man, which looked scary to the guys from the outside. Hyuk was already used to the way the teacher behaved, but for the kids the picture looked from the outside like he was being pressured, and he was running so fast perhaps because his whole life depended on it. The announcer announced the finale, which would take place in 30 minutes, and they voiced Jean and those three guys, after which Pak said that in that case he would go get ready and said that they would see each other again, to which Hyuk waved back. The young man still thought that sneakers with spikes were the best idea from his dad. Looking at the sneakers his new friends were wearing and the spikes were clearly visible on the soles, Jean thought about asking his dad to buy him some too. There was no excitement as such in the final, but the teacher sitting in the establishment with Hyuk could not calm down that the boy had overtaken the best runner and set a new record for Cheongnam Junior School. The happy coach told the young man that he would pay for everything and that he could eat as much as he wanted, and also added that from now on Fridays, he had to go to relay training at Taeyong School, and asked if the boy could get there on his own. Hyuk already had not only an answer to the question of whether he would be able to ride on his own, but also an idea of how the training would go, and he already saw in advance how the coach from the Taeyong School would pair him with one of the guys who had met him. The guys stood in front of the curator, who explained that, with the help of practice, it would be determined who would stand in what order in the relay race. Based on information from the teacher, Jean even had an idea of how the coach says that the prize for winning the competition is money. Unlike the guys who were already thinking about how best to hide the money from their mother, Jean was thinking maybe he should buy those same studded sneakers with his winnings. And so, enjoying the delicious food, the boy answered the teacher that given that there were 6 buses a day, he would be able to get to training without any problems. The coach asked the young man to be careful and treated him to pickled radish, which was as tasty as everything else. Jean licked his lips at the delicacies he was currently tasting, but even now he was wondering if his little sister could eat jjajangmyeon yet. Because of his thoughts about his sister, Hyuk again imagined the situation that if he won that money he would definitely take his family out to dinner. And if it wasn't dinner, the guy imagined how they all went to the market with their families and he bought little Eugene that same delicious jjajangmyeon. Hyuk was already looking forward to the moment when he too could make some contribution to the family, in particular take care of his sister. Even spending time with his family at the market stall selling fresh fruit seemed like fun to Jean. An important moment had arrived, and the father was already seeing his son off to training, asking if he had forgotten anything, to which Hyuk said that he had checked everything before leaving. As it turned out, shortly before the independent trips the boss took care of it, and overjoyed by his son's success bought him studded sneakers after all. Even now Dad asked Hyuk to wait a second and started to take out something to give to his son before leaving for training. Gwon gave his son 4 10,000 won bills so that his son would have money for the fare, and so that he could treat his friends to tteokbokki. Jean stood a little confused because that kind of money would be enough to feed a company of soldiers with tteokbokki, but looking at how his father was glowing with happiness, he couldn't help but take the money. The son also happily waved to his dad, shouting that he was leaving and would soon return and tell him how everything went. Gwon, under the influence of emotions, also stood and waved back to the boy, wishing him a good journey and fun at training. Appa watched his son go, seeing much more in his travels than Hyuk had, and had already done much more than buy sneakers with spikes. The other day Gwang talked to Hong Ki-jun and he immediately asked what the prize would be, but the Appa clarified that it was not about winning but about the fact that the young man got to the regional competitions, and that was already a success. The father explained to his friend that he was worried about his son, and that he would not get hurt because during competition there are moments of collision with the wall. Appa asked a counter-question about the likelihood of Jin's disappointment, but Hong said that in life absolutely everyone encounters failures. A friend told Gwon something like a meditation about how parents don't want their children to be burdened by difficult times, but no matter how hard they try, this is also an important experience. While Hong was talking about how he as a parent would like to help his child overcome difficulties, he finished drawing funny portraits of his relatives, and Gwon agreed with what his friend said. Gwon hesitated a bit and decided to point out another important point, namely the clarification from the coach that Hyuk runs on equal terms with the track and field athletes. Just when Appa wanted to add that he knew something else, Hong immediately interrupted him, saying that Mr. Gwang was still the same since he never said directly what was on his mind. At the moment when Hong asked if Gwang had called to find out how to support his son, if he wanted to become a professional in track and field, he was brought documents. The folder with the papers indicated a draft plan for the creation and maintenance of the Sikahan Sports Fund. He said that there was no reason to worry, and that he would take care of this matter, and finally suggested that they meet when the children had such an opportunity. Appa thanked his friend and asked him to get back to work, and Hong wanted to tell him to take care of himself, but he didn't have time because Guan had already passed out. And so having a strong cover behind his back, the father stood happily watching his son grow up and how success goes hand in hand with him. The day before the Cheongnam competition in Gongju, the smell of roast pork tickled the nose and the ears were filled with the coach's words about how hard the boys had worked in preparation. The coach asked the boys to try to make sure that their efforts were not in vain, and to do this they needed to eat well and rest, to which all three shouted thank you for the food. Eugene was asked if he would like some soda to go with this variety of food. With his mouth full, the guy refused the soda, saying that he would drink regular water so as not to burden his body. Suddenly the guys heard Sol-chan making strange sounds and were very scared for him, thinking that he had already choked or had an allergy, and then he blurted out in a hoarse voice that he seemed to be dying. But in order not to frighten everyone nearby even more, Chan immediately said that the food here was delicious to death, although even the waitress had already begun to panic. The guy was literally melting on the table from the delicious food, while his friends and the trainer were almost stunned, and the waitress, nervously laughing, was shocked that it was so delicious and said that she would bring more meat now. Heaving a sigh of relief, Hyuk also finally smiled, thinking that his appetite had increased because they were all after hard training, and that his emotions had been given free rein because they were sharing food with the entire team. Eugene caught himself thinking that he now liked all these training sessions, communication, and sitting in cafes more than running with Zangan. The guy realized that running with friends who have the same sporting spirit as he does is a completely different feeling. Such warming thoughts in a pile of food that tickled the receptors caused the young man to smile and feel calm inside, as if he was where he should be. Pak looked intently in one direction and asked his friends if they were ready for the most important competition of their lives. Chan and Byun had such focused and serious looks, and their bodies were frozen in readiness to break forward. And then Pak shouted attention and the sound of a shot, after which the guys rushed at each other with pillows, screaming and laughing, and at that moment Eugene, who had just come out of the shower, froze right in the doorway. Considering that inside the young man there was also his past adult life, he stood and watched his friends, thinking of them as children who were told to go to bed and have a good rest, but they did not listen. All this adult nonsense was abruptly knocked out of his head by a pillow that flew straight into Jin's face. The guys were scared and froze, not knowing how their new friend would react, and Hyuk himself froze with a pillow in his hands, not yet understanding what to do. The calmness and slight smile of the young man only frightened him more than if he had answered something directly right away, and in the meantime Jin's nose had already turned red. Confused and scared but cheerful at the same time, the guys were afraid to even breathe because they didn't know what to expect from their friend. Eugene rushed to his friends, shouting that they were now doomed, and the guys, not knowing this guy very well, were afraid that they were really in trouble now. And Hyuk, smiling, joined in this stupid but such a fun game, showing that no matter how serious he looked he would still be fooling around. The guy felt warmth and excitement inside from the fact that the sports camp is cool and there is meaning in spending time with people who share your interests. The young man also felt the difference between when he fooled around with his family and how they fooled around with the guys, which added a new spark of joy to life. The coach spotted all 4 violators and shouted at them to go to bed quickly, and this was something to be afraid of. The guys calmed down and agreed that it was indeed time to go to bed, and only Eugene felt awkward. Now the young man's thoughts were occupied with the fact that he was eagerly awaiting tomorrow in order to taste its colors to the fullest. While his son was at the camp, Appa couldn't find a place for himself, which is why he woke up in the middle of the night and sat in the hall with a camera in his hands. The woman noticed that her beloved was missing and, going out into the hall, asked him what had happened, and he explained that all his thoughts were occupied with his son and that he would really like to visit him. The wife reminded her husband that he himself told her that none of the parents would go, and if they came to support Hyuk it could hurt others. The father was upset but agreed with what his beloved said, so he decided that in that case it would be better not to go. Suddenly the woman clapped her hands, which meant that an idea had come to her mind and was supposed to work perfectly. On the day of the competition, the guys had already arrived at the Gongju Sports Complex, which shocked them both with its size and the fact that it had only opened last fall. The guys stopped communicating because the coaches behind them were very loudly complaining about something. The poor guy who was responsible for the schedule was surrounded by all the coaches, and they were shouting that the schedule with breaks was compiled terribly, and the conditions of the players were not taken into account at all, and everyone needed to know when the list of participants would be posted. No matter how the man explained that he and his colleagues were also organizing an event of such a scale for the first time, no one cared and everyone was on edge, and Eugene also found it a little strange that both the qualifying round and the final were held on the same day. Hyuk was also not thrilled that, with so many participants, they would have to hang around here until the evening, but Chan thought that his friend was looking at a girl from another team and, patting him on the shoulder, asked if she was cute. Chan had already managed to notice how beautiful the girl's skin was, and even suggested that she was most likely from the city. Byun also paid attention to the girls' team and noted the height of the one everyone was looking at, and he added that she was like some kind of celebrity. Pak nudged Jean in a friendly manner, asking who he thought was prettier out of those girls. It was the first time that Hyuk was put in such an awkward position, because of which he couldn't even put a couple of words together, since in his past life he might have already found someone who he thought was pretty, but he couldn't say it. The guys asked again to clarify whether the girl from the team was pretty, and then Jean saw his mother and Sooyoung as one of the main women in the life of an adult Hyuk. But the young man should have thought now with his teenage brain about whether that girl was pretty compared to his mother and Sooyoung, and how it seemed to him that the athlete looked ordinary. Thank God the guy didn't have to answer anything, because the start of the 100-meter race among junior high girls was announced, and the kids rushed to the stands as spectators, and then the rest of the participants followed. Jean and his friends were rooting for the rest of the kids they knew and shouting words of encouragement at the top of their lungs for everyone. Byun was amazed at how fast the participants who just competed were, and asked if anyone knew who they were, to which Park said that they were Daesun Junior High and that they had already won last year. The participants were just passing the baton to each other, and the guys had already started talking about their trump card, thanks to which those guys are so fast. Suddenly the stick fell out of the hands of one of the participants, and this was a very stressful incident for everyone. Byun said that he was very sorry for those guys, and Hyuk was surprised, but Chan had already asked Chi-bum not to take that stick during their run, and he drank some water and nodded. Jean asked Byun what was wrong with the stick that was dropped, and he explained that if the stick fell once, it would fall again in the next run. Byun was already clearly nervous, saying that this was not just stupid stories but a proven fact that had already happened in real life, but the coach said that it was time for them to go because it was their turn, and Pak also needed to go to the toilet. Chi-bum ran to the curator almost last in order to take the baton, while the announcer announced to take the inventory and take a place on the starting line. Poor Pak was horrified when he saw that the stick that had fallen out of the hands of the previous team was left in the bucket, and Chan had asked him not to take it, but considering that the others knew about the superstition about bad luck, they left it. Chi-bum felt how behind his back everyone started whispering and discussing the fact that the participant was late to choose a stick and they got that unlucky one. Byun and Chan looked at each other with excitement after they found out what color they got, and Jean realized that right before the race the children's balance was shaken. But Hyuk was not one of those who give up, not only so early but also because of some stupid superstition, because what is much more important is what data they came here with, and the stick fell out of his hands only because of excitement and self-hypnosis. Jean could feel how nervous his friends were, and for the first time he had so little time to figure out how to help. The coach too, under the heat of passion, could not squeeze out a word, because he himself had already begun to worry about his children. Suddenly someone loudly shouted from the stands the names of all the guys from Jean's team and added that they were all great and would cope. Hyuk began to look around the raging crowd of people for the voice that had leveled his mood and encouraged his friends. Hyuk's family was sitting in the stands, and even little Eugene was waving her hands at him, and his father continued to shout for his son to give it his all. The guy looked with his mouth open and couldn't believe that his family had come such a long way to support him, and even his friends. Inside, Hyuk felt a little aching from how much his family loved him, and he wanted to hug them so much right now, and this was the very fuel that would help him and his team win. The guys heard cries of support in their direction, which surprised them because they didn't expect this, and the situation was critical. Jean turned to his team as if to show them that they were shouting such words at them for a reason, but because they really could do more than they thought. Chan nodded and smiled in response to his friend's gaze, and Byun also began to look more confident, and the team spirit finally returned and the fear retreated to the side. Now Jean knew for sure that victory was in their hands, because with such an attitude handing over this stupid piece of wood would not be difficult. The blue stick landed on the starting line and the curator called the team's attention. Chi-bum was the first to start the race and moved with dignity alongside other competitors who were also determined to win. The moment of passing the baton came, and Beg took it upon himself, confidently grabbing the piece of wood as if it were a victory that needed to be grabbed as tightly as possible. The parents shouted at the top of their lungs not only to Jean but also to the members of his team, so that they would know throughout the entire runway that they were not alone and that people believed in them. Hyuk heard these cries and was filled with them like energy that would carry him forward, and in fact it didn't matter whether it was a victory or a defeat because he had already won one victory by saving his family. Chan ran with all his might, forgetting about the stupid superstition and putting all his faith in the fact that he would be able to pass the baton to his new cool friend. The guys stood in shock from their friend who jumped above his head today, and there was no trace left of the unfaithful Chan. The guy ran to his friend as if he was freeing himself from the shackles of some fictions and rumors, and around him, there was only him, the Tribune Jean, and victory in the hands of Blue. Victory in the form of a baton was passed from one strong hand to another and rushed towards the finish line. Hyuk ran like the wind with only one thought in his head, that there was nothing more valuable to him than family. Mom froze in anticipation and Dad took pictures of his son without expecting him to win but just to capture this next cool moment in his life, and even little Eugene reached out to her brother to congratulate him, and it didn't matter what. Jean surged forward without hesitation but simply because he liked it and felt that way. By tearing the finishing tape, Hyuk took another big piece of this life simply because he knew he could do it. Mom and baby screamed so loudly that the poor dad was deafened, but he didn't mind because it was really worth it. The father was shocked that it turned out his beloved could scream so loudly, and she realized only later how happy she was, and immediately asked for forgiveness if she hurt her beloved's ears. While Jean stood and evened out his breathing, the announcer announced the places that the different groups occupied. Hyuk didn't even have to listen to what the host was saying because the guys knocked him down with their shout that they had won after all. Pak rejoiced and shouted that he knew that Jean could be trusted completely and entirely, and not only in competitions. When the adrenaline subsided a little, Pak shared with the guys the feeling that his parents were here and perhaps even the other guys too. The guys confirmed that they also heard the voices of their relatives, and it helped them a lot, so they started turning their heads around to find them. The announcer asked the participants to return to their seats so that the tournament could proceed without a hitch, but Jean was already in the stands. All that was left was to end up there in body. Mom was ready to cry from happiness, but Dad continued to capture important moments with his camera, especially when the whole team was assembled and little Eugene still wanted to be in her brother's arms. Jean waved to his family with his hand, in which victory in the form of a blue stick was still firmly held. Other spectators did not miss the fact that such a brilliant finish was achieved by a 13-year-old boy. In addition to the usual parents of friends and acquaintances, the tournament was watched by those who were even more interested in the results of the participants. One of the strangers told his boss that 10.5 seconds was a new record, and he agreed, adding that they had finally found that nugget. The men had their eyes on the talent they had been looking for all their time, and now all that was left was to establish contact. It would seem that son Jin Hyuk took part in the tournament and signed so many autographs at the school gates that he became a star of the country. The school children looked with delight at the signature that the athlete left them as a keepsake, while Mi Kyung's friend as always teased her friend about his status as a 4-time champion. The young man in his own way was not entirely comfortable with the way the school was publicizing his not-so-great achievement, and he was especially put under pressure by the fact that his name was hanging on a banner at the entrance to the school. Mi Kyung was the only one who became interested in how her friend became a 4-time champion at once, to which Hyuk explained that he took part in other competitions that day, including the 100 and 200-meter races as well as the long jump. Having made a smart face, Sun did not begin to explain to his already surprised friend that the tournament rules allowed participation in other competitions. But Mi still asked when the national competitions would be held now and whether they would be in Gongju again, to which she heard that they would take place in a month and would be in Daegu. Considering that the competition this time would be nearby, Kayon asked if her friend wanted her to come and support him, but he immediately refused, using the argument that it would be a school day, plus there would be many children from other regions there. Mi froze like a statue and fell silent because her friend was a moron, and Hyuk also froze with his mouth open, but at that moment he began to understand what his girlfriend was trying to convey. A second later, the guy was already incredibly delighted that Mi had decided to also try athletics. Due to the fact that Jean thought not only like a boy but also like an adult, he realized that the girl in her own way envied her friend's popularity, so she decided to try herself in sports too. Hyuk very sharply and decisively pointed his finger in the direction of Mi, who was already clearly regretting her decision, and said that training was starting right now. The girl was horrified because she watched as the bus actually drove past, and now there was nowhere to go except to try to run home. It was quite obvious that for a newbie runner like me, such a first run home would be difficult, and the poor guy, barely keeping up with his friends, screamed that if they had gone by bus they would have died. Hyuk ran ahead lightly and still managed to tell the student Mi-kyung to stop whining and think about how long it would take them to run home at such a fast speed. The young man ran even easier and faster this time from the mere thought that now he and Mi-kyung would run together, and as soon as he mentally told Zangan that he now had a competitor, his girlfriend screamed that she was leaving because she was not interested in running. One day Jean was sitting in the yard with little Eugene and teaching her what everyone's name is, but so far she's managed to do something more funny than to correctly name her relatives. For example, the baby's father's Song Guan Yun was Yung Yang Yun, and Han Yu Yun's mother was Any Eon, but she tried her best. But the most interesting moment was when it came to her brother's name, and instead of Sun Jin Hyuk, the girl said Sun Kaka, to which even Zangan twitched his ear as if he had spoken and burst out laughing. Even the second time when Hyuk asked him to repeat his name, Eugene still said Yung Kaka. The guy even guessed that most likely Hong Soo-young taught her sister such a nasty thing and only hoped that the little girl would outgrow this evil joke. The young man didn't struggle for long to get his sister to say the name correctly, but instead he relaxed and looked at the sky, thinking that when there is no one at home it becomes so quiet. The only thing that confused Jean a little was that his mother had already left a long time ago to buy his father a snack, and perhaps they decided to eat together, and so she hadn't come back yet. The parents actually had a joint snack, and Hyuk at that moment was on the verge of discovering something new for himself, because knowing that his parents lived together, he didn't understand whether they were really interested in continuing to spend time with each other. Scratching the back of his head, the guy repeated to himself this unknowing truth that if you like someone you want to be with them all the time. At that moment, Hyuk immediately had an image of Hong Soo-young in her beautiful yellow dress and how she was dragging him somewhere by the hand. Hyuk lowered his gaze and was tormented by the fact that the knowledge of something more was so close, but he still did not understand, and then little Eugene fell under his gaze, who was watching her brother with eyes full of pure love. Jean felt like he was struck by electricity from such a number of pleasant and incomprehensible sensations, especially after Eugene's smile. Hyuk couldn't resist and started tickling her sister, saying how cute she was, and her head was like a ripe apple that you just wanted to eat. And even Zangan liked this amount of joy because he also started wagging his tail. Hugging his little sister, Jean thought that although he doesn't understand romance, he knows for sure that the little girl is charming and she wasn't against her older brother's attitude towards her. Zangan suddenly stuck his tail up and stared at the gate, but Hyuk was still fooling around with his sister, telling her that if someone says she's cute, then let her tell him that she has an older ugly brother. The boys only noticed the gate when they heard the rough voices of two strangers who entered someone else's territory without permission, discussing how nice the house was, and one of them was even smoking a cigarette. For now there was a safe distance between the owners of the house and the uninvited guests, both physical and verbal, but Hyuk still didn't know who it was and why people interested in his father's land had come again. It was hard not to notice how recently the number of people from the city who came to see the land had increased significantly. Jean remembered very well how his father read the papers, which clearly indicated even the market value of the property. At that moment, both the guy and Uncle Hong were shouting at Song Guangyun not to think about selling the plot, even though it was his father's land and it was up to him to decide what to do with it. How shocked the young man was when Hong told his friend that even if he wanted to sell the land, he should sell it to him. Now Hyuk also protested against Uncle Hong, who brazenly asked to sell the land to him, but fortunately his father was also against selling the land just like his son, so all the vultures left empty-handed. A brazen spit from the mouth of another idiot distracted Jean from thoughts about the last uninvited guests. The camel didn't stop after he entered the yard and spat there, but even continued talking to the children, trying to find out if they were home alone and where their parents had gone. For now Jean was calmly thinking about who this person was and trying to remember whether his father had made an appointment with him, but the huge carcass, without even waiting for an answer from Hyuk, continued to speak with impudence about the fact that if his father was here, then let him come out. Here the guy was already more aggressively disposed towards this pig, who had entered someone else's territory, and was also giving orders left and right. The bastard repeated his question again, asking if they had really heard him, and now even Zangan was ready to defend his master, but Hyuk answered sternly but calmly that his father was not there right now, so it was better for them to leave. Suddenly the huge idiot barked something like, "What the hell, did the man leave the children alone, and where the hell was he?" And at that moment poor Eugene got scared and started crying. This was the starting point where both Zangan and Hyuk were shocked that the little one was brought to this, but the pig did not stop and, covering his ears, ordered the guy to close the little one's mouth again. The idiots continued to mumble something about how the children were left alone, and in general the parents had created a mess here, and against the background of the crying Eugene, Hyuk, he said through clenched teeth that if there were no adults then it would be better for the uninvited guests to get out of here. And quite unexpectedly the guy got a slap on the back of the head with words about how he was such a brat and was already being rude to his elders, and poor Eugene went completely silent, but this was only because she was even more afraid for her brother. The little girl in tears pressed herself even closer to Jean, and with great fear and tears in her eyes looked at the monster that had offended her protector. Without thinking twice, Zangan immediately grabbed the freak's leg with his teeth as tightly as possible and didn't let go. But the pig was much bigger than the small dog, so the first thing the bastard did was kick Zangan, causing him to bark loudly in pain. Hyuk felt like someone had dipped him in an ice hole when he saw what had happened to his four-legged friend, who was lying on the ground and breathing heavily. Before the young man's eyes immediately appeared that terrible scene from his past life when his hated uncle beat Zangan to death and he lay covered in blood. In the blink of an eye, Jean was next to the freak and grabbed him by the clothes so tightly that he couldn't even move. It would seem that the boy could be capable of such a thing, but anger and adrenaline took their toll, so the huge pig, barely breathing, hung in the air in the strong arms of the one who was ready to tear to shreds for his family. The bastard was sweating and just groaning, unable to even move, and Hyuk continued to hold him and watch that nasty, impudent face. If it weren't for the second idiot who understood that things were bad and didn't start to dissuade the guy, everything would have ended in death. Only after Jean was addressed with politeness did he look away, mindful of the limits of reason. The young man also had enough strength to throw that huge carcass far away from himself onto the ground, which left his second partner in even greater shock. Hyuk briefly told the freaks that if they understood everything then it would be better for them to leave right now, to which he eventually heard from the victim that the brat was a real monster, but his partner lifted the pig from the ground and said that that was enough and that they really had to leave. When the bastards got into the car and sped away with creaking wheels, only then did Hyuk turn around and shout to Zangan if he was okay. The guy examined his furry friend for injuries and found nothing serious, while Eugene sat there already exhausted from such intense stress. The girl was crying, and Hyuk, after Zangan, immediately went up to his sister and asked if she was very scared. When the defender was nearby and Eugene was able to hug him, she said Appa very bitterly, and at that moment calming the baby. The guy thought that perhaps he had gone too far, thereby scaring her. Jean glanced at his hand, replaying in his head everything that had happened a few minutes ago, and he himself could not even believe that he could so easily grab a grown man by the collar. Zangan looked at his master as if he understood all his feelings and experiences, and the young man looked back with the thought that for a moment he forgot himself, as if the lights had been turned off. One thing Hyuk was sure of was that it was that bastard who first crossed the line of what was permissible in relation to his family, and the way he behaved could not be allowed to go unpunished. From that situation the guy made an important conclusion, looking at his sister, that he would never again show this side of himself to the little girl. Hyuk silently hugged the little girl, showing her that he was nearby and that he was no longer scary and menacing, thereby asking her forgiveness, but without words, and Zangan also joined them, as if telling his friend that he did the right thing. At dinner, Jean decided not to hide anything and tell his parents everything as it was from beginning to end, knowing that they would take his side. Without a drop of lies or doubt, the young man spoke about today's unpleasant incident without even looking away. The parents were horrified by what their children had to go through today, and that at that moment they couldn't even help them. Most of all, the father felt terrible from the mixture of so many feelings, because he was close by and could have protected the children, but at the same time his son took on this role, and if you think about it, he was also still a child and was not obliged to take on such responsibility. Anger at the bastards and worries about his children took over, and the head of the family, unable to bear it, slammed his hands on the table and declared that from now on he would deal with such people himself. While the father left the table to cool down and look at the situation soberly, the mother began to worry even more, asking if the children were okay and asking for forgiveness for not returning home for a long time. Guan left silently and without turning around to face the others in order to calm his own ardor away from his family. Jean watched his dad, and with every fiber of his being, he felt that he was furious, which led to the thought that perhaps he shouldn't have said anything at all. The door to the room closed carefully, just like the parents' conversations on such a painful topic. One ordinary day, Hyuk returned from school but found no one in the hall, and no one